At 10 a.m. on Christmas morning 2026, my biological son stood in the doorway of a mansion I had bought for him, staring at me with dead eyes. "You aren't part of this family anymore," he said, his voice as cold as the winter wind. "Get lost, old man." Behind him, I saw his wife, Tiffany, covering her mouth to hide a cruel smirk, while her parents raised crystal glasses in a mocking toast. I stood there for a moment, holding a turkey I had spent 6 hours roasting. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I simply nodded, walked back to my rusted truck, and threw the turkey into the trash. Then I sat in the driver's seat and made a single phone call. 5 minutes later, the music inside that mansion stopped. 10 minutes later, every single guest at their dining table fled the property like it was on fire. My name is Thaddeus Moore. I am 70 years old, and my son thought he was throwing away a broken, aging laborer. He had no idea he was actually declaring war on the true owner of the ground he stood on. This morning had started with a quiet, honest hope. I was driving my 20-year-old Ford F-150 down the winding roads of Whispering Pines, an exclusive gated community with heated driveways and lawns manicured with surgical precision. On the passenger seat beside me sat a 20-pound turkey, wrapped tightly in 3 layers of foil and thick towels. It was Betty's recipe. My late wife had seasoned the bird every Christmas for 40 years, and since her passing, I kept the tradition alive. The cab filled with the rich, earthy scent of sage, rosemary, and slow-roasted meat. To me, that was the smell of love. But to the people in this neighborhood, it probably smelled like something that didn't belong. I pulled into the driveway at 42 Oakview Drive, a massive colonial revival home with white pillars and grand bay windows. I knew every inch of that house because 3 years ago, before authorizing the purchase through a shell company, I personally inspected its foundation. My son, Darnell, always believed he was leasing it for $1 a month from a benevolent, anonymous investor he had charmed at a networking event. He loved telling people he was a marketing genius who knew how to work the system. He never suspected that the investor was the man who used to change his oil while wearing grease-stained overalls. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. I was wearing my best Sunday suit, but it was 10 years old and a little tight around the shoulders. My hands were rough and calloused from 50 years of laying pipe and welding steel. In a wealthy neighborhood where people called the police if a car drove too slowly, I was an old black man. But I was Darnell's father, and it was Christmas Day. That had to mean something. I carried the heavy turkey up the long driveway. Through the massive window I could see the golden glow of the chandeliers. Darnell was standing by the fireplace with a glass of scotch. He wore a velvet jacket that likely cost more than my truck. Tiffany sat on the sofa, laughing at a joke made by her father, Brent. Brent and Susan, Tiffany's parents, were there too. They looked like a picture from a magazine, polished, expensive, and completely relaxed. I rang the doorbell. I heard the chimes echo inside, followed by the sharp click of formal shoes on marble. The door opened. Darnell stood there, filling the frame. He didn't step aside. He didn't smile. He looked down at the foil package in my arms, then raised his eyes to mine with an expression of pure annoyance. "Dad," he said. His voice dropped low like a snake's hiss. "What are you doing here?" I adjusted the weight of the bird. "Merry Christmas, son. I brought the turkey. Your mother's recipe. I thought we were eating at one." Darnell ran a hand over his freshly groomed beard. He glanced back at his guests, then stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door almost shut behind him. The warm air drifted out, smelling of expensive cologne and pine. "Look, plans changed," Darnell said, refusing to make eye contact. "Tiffany's parents are here, Brent and Susan. They flew in from the West Coast last night. This is a formal brunch, Dad. A high-level networking opportunity. Brent is introducing me to some major players in tech." A chill that had nothing to do with the falling snow spread through my chest. "So, I'm not invited?" I asked. "I put on a tie, Darnell." Darnell let out a short, cruel laugh. "A tie? Dad, look at yourself. You drove up in that rolling scrap heap and parked it right out front. The neighbors are probably already texting the homeowners association. And that smell. You smell like motor oil and old spices." "That's sage, Darnell," I said softly. "It's your mother's blend." "It smells like poverty," Darnell snapped, his polite mask slipping away entirely. "Tiffany's parents come from status, Dad. They don't understand your world. They don't want to sit across from a man who looks like he just crawled out from under a sink. You just don't fit the aesthetic or the class we're building here." The door behind him opened wider. Tiffany appeared, wearing a white silk dress that looked like a deep breath would ruin it. Her blonde hair was pinned in an intricate style. She looked at me, her nose wrinkling. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Oh, Thaddeus, you brought food. How quaint." "Tiffany," Darnell said, stepping between us. "Dad was just leaving. He got the dates mixed up." I looked at my son. I looked at the woman he married. I saw the contempt etched into their faces. I saw Brent and Susan peering out from the hallway, holding their wine glasses, watching the scene play out like a reality show staged for their entertainment. "Darnell," I said, my voice low and steady. "I am your father. I paid for your college. I helped you when you wrecked your first car. I am the only family you have left in this world." Darnell's face hardened. He leaned in close, his breath heavy with aged scotch. "That's the problem, Dad. You're an anchor. I'm trying to sail, and you're dragging me to the bottom with your blue-collar stories and your embarrassing truck. You aren't part of this family anymore. You're a liability. Get lost." He stepped back and grabbed the door handle. Tiffany gave a little wave, a gesture mockingly polite, though her eyes held a cruel satisfaction. "Go home, Thaddeus," she said. "We'll send you a Christmas card." The heavy oak door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the quiet morning air like a gunshot. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. Through the glass panels, I saw Darnell turn back toward his guests. I saw him shrug and laugh. I saw Tiffany lean into him, whispering something that made her mother laugh as well. I stood on the porch for a long time. The turkey in my arms was still hot, but my hands felt like ice. I looked at the wreath hanging on the door, knowing it cost $400 because I monitored the credit card statements. I looked at the Mercedes in the driveway, the one Darnell claimed he bought with a bonus, but was actually leased under my holding company. I turned and walked down the steps. I didn't look back. I walked to the end of the driveway where the large metal trash bin sat. I lifted the lid, unhurried. I dropped the 20-pound turkey straight into the bin. It landed with a heavy thud. I wiped my hands on my handkerchief, walked over to my truck, and climbed inside. The engine roared to life with a cough and a splutter. I let it idle for a moment, watching the house. Inside, they felt safe, warm, arrogant, and completely oblivious to the shift occurring beneath their feet. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I scrolled past Darnell's contact. I scrolled past the local mechanic. I stopped at a name I hadn't called in 2 years. Reginald Moss. Reggie was the most expensive, ruthless attorney in the state. He was also the man who sat next to me in the trenches 50 years ago. He picked up on the second ring. "Thaddeus," Reggie's voice boomed. "Merry Christmas, you old badger. Calling to wish me well." "Not today, Reggie," I said. My voice was calm, terrifyingly so. "I'm sitting outside the Oakview Drive property." "Is the asset damaged?" Reggie asked, his tone instantly shifting to professional alertness. "The asset has turned hostile," I corrected. "Darnell just put me off the property," he announced. "I am no longer family. He's entertaining unauthorized guests." "The lease agreement, the backup contract we kept in the safe," Reggie said. "Clause 4A. Breach of respect and failure to maintain familial conduct results in immediate termination." "You insisted on that specific clause, Thaddeus. I told you it was severe back then." "It turns out it was necessary," I said. "Execute it Plan Z, Reggie. Take it all back, every last piece." There was a brief pause on the line. Then I heard the sound of keys clicking. "I can have the recovery team there in 12 minutes, Reggie said. "I can freeze the financial backing in 3. "Are you sure, Thaddeus? That is the nuclear option." I looked through the window one last time. I saw Darnell raising a glass in another toast. He looked like a king in a castle made of clouds. "I'm sure," I said. "Start the clock." I hung up and leaned back against the seat. I didn't drive away. I wanted a front row seat. I watched the digital clock on the dashboard. 10:12 a.m. By 10:15, the first domino inside that house would fall. I pictured Tiffany trying to run my black credit card. The secondary card I gave Darnell for emergencies, which they used to fund their luxury lifestyle. Through the catering company's terminal, I waited. The winter sun reflected off the snow, blindingly bright. Suddenly, the front door opened again. A man in a catering uniform stepped out, looking confused and annoyed. He held a card reader up toward the sky as if searching for a signal. Then he went back inside. 2 minutes later, 3 massive commercial tow trucks turned the corner. These weren't the polite, roadside assistance vehicles you call for a flat tire. These were heavy-duty recovery units. Massive beasts of steel and cable with flashing yellow lights. They didn't run sirens, but the rumble of their Ebel diesel engines vibrated through the quiet morning air. They pulled up directly in front of the driveway, blocking the exit. The lead driver was Big Mike, the man who managed my construction fleet. He stepped down, holding a clipboard. He didn't look at the house. He looked at my truck, caught my single nod, and strode up the driveway. He didn't ring the bell. He pounded on the door with a fist the size of a ham. I rolled down my window to hear the music of the consequences. The door swung open. Darnell stood there again, but this time his whiskey glass was gone. "Can I help you?" Darnell demanded, trying to maintain his aura of superiority. "You're blocking my driveway, Mr. Darnell Moore." Mike's voice echoed across the yard. "I'm here on behalf of TNB Holding. We have an order to impound the Mercedes S-Class and the Lexus SUV." "What?" Darnell let out a nervous, disbelieving laugh. That's absurd. I own those cars. My father bought them for me." "Correction," Mike said, looking down at his clipboard. "The corporation bought them. You were a permitted user. Due to a breach of the user agreement, that authorization was revoked 10 minutes ago. Specifically, the clause regarding adverse actions against the benefactor." Tiffany ran to the door. "What is going on? Who are these people?" "They're towing the cars, baby," Darnell stammered. "This has to be a mistake, a computer glitch." Mike signaled his drivers. They didn't wait for permission. Chains clanked loudly. Hooks dropped. The first tow truck backed up to the Mercedes. Metal struck metal with a sharp, violent clash. "Stop!" Tiffany screamed. "That's my car." "You can't take my Lexus. My yoga mat is still inside." "Call the police, Brent," her father shouted from the doorway. "This is theft." I watched Darnell pull out his phone. He dialed frantically. I watched his face fall apart as he realized the call wouldn't go through. I had canceled the family phone plan too. Mike hooked the Mercedes. The car lifted into the air, looking helpless and heavy. I started my engine. I shifted the truck into drive and pulled up slowly past the house. I didn't accelerate. I drove at a crawl. Darnell raised his head. He saw me. He saw his father, the man he called a liability, driving the battered Ford he so despised. Our eyes met. He looked at the tow trucks. He looked back at me. For the first time in his life, the math began to add up in his head. The terror in his eyes was absolute. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just kept driving. I had a meeting with a banker to attend, and my son had a very long walk ahead of him. From the cab of my F-150, I watched the scene through the bay window like a silent movie. In the warmth of the mansion I paid for, Darnell raised a crystal champagne flute high in the air. His face was flushed from a mix of alcohol and arrogance. Beside him, Tiffany threw her head back in laughter, her long neck exposed, while her father, Brent, clapped Darnell on the shoulder with a paternal pride he had done nothing to earn. It was a picture-perfect Christmas scene, the kind printed on holiday, cards sold to people who dreamed of lives they couldn't afford. Scene. I remembered the day we bought that black Mercedes S-Class sitting in the driveway. Darnell stood in the dealership showroom, eyes wide like a child, begging me for it. He told me he needed the car to close deals, that clients wouldn't trust a marketing director who drove a Honda. I signed the $120,000 check without blinking. Not because I believed him, but because I wanted him to feel proud. I wanted to give him the starting point in life I never had. I registered the title under TNB Holding purely to manage liability, a detail Darnell dismissed as boring paperwork. Now, watching him toast to the very people who looked down on me, I realized the car was never a tool for business. It was just another costume for the role he was playing. A play where I had been written out entirely. The silence inside my truck was heavy, broken only by the steady hum of the engine. Then the ground began to vibrate. It was subtle at first, a low rumble that shook loose snow from the pine branches along the street. The sound grew, a mechanical roar that swallowed the distant sound of holiday music. I checked my watch. Plan Z was moving right on schedule. Around the corner came 3 massive recovery trucks driving in a synchronized formation that would make a military convoy proud. These weren't small flatbeds called for a flat tire. These were heavy recovery vehicles, fitted with hydraulic lifts and reinforced steel bumpers, built to reclaim assets regardless of resistance. Their amber warning lights cut through the gray winter morning, flashing in rotation and casting warning signals across the pristine snow. As they approached the house, they didn't slow down. They swung into the driveway with practiced precision, completely blocking the exit. The lead truck, driven by Big Mike, backed toward the Mercedes at a formidable pace. The reverse alarm emitted a sharp, steady signal, breaking the quiet of the upscale neighborhood. Inside the house, the spell broke. I saw panic begin to spread. The guests set their drinks down. A woman in a red dress pointed frantically at the window. Darnell shoved past Brent, nearly knocking the older man over in his rush to reach the door. The polished facade of their high-class brunch fell apart before my eyes. The front door slammed open, and Darnell rushed out onto the porch. He forgot his coat. The biting wind whipped at his velvet jacket, and snow began to cling to his expensive dress shirt. He looked frantic, his eyes darting between the trucks, the drivers, and the cars he believed were his birthright. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "What are you doing? Get away from my car!" He ran down the steps, slipped on a patch of ice, and nearly fell face-first into the snow. He scrambled up, placing himself between the lead truck and the Mercedes, spreading his arms as if he could physically stop the hydraulic lift. "Stop!" he demanded. "Stop right now. This is a mistake." Tiffany rushed out right behind him, shouting. Her silk dress dragged through the slush, but she hardly seemed to notice. "That's my car. You can't take it. My gifts are still in the trunk." Big Mike didn't blink. He stepped down from his cab, wiped his greasy hands on his pants, and looked Darnell up and down with complete indifference. It was the look of a man who had heard every excuse in the book. "Please step." "Sir," Mike said, his voice calm and resonant. "I have an order to recover both of these vehicles." Darnell's face turned a shade of deep frustration I had never seen on him before. "Recovered? That's impossible. I pay for this car. My father paid for this car." "Call him right now." He pointed a trembling finger at my truck parked across the street. "Call him. He'll tell you." Mike looked at his clipboard, then looked over at me. I lowered my window slowly. The cold air rushed in, but I felt completely steady. Darnell's eyes locked onto mine. He looked desperate now, the arrogance from 10 minutes ago completely gone, replaced by the sheer panic of a child who had broken something valuable. "Dad!" he shouted. Tell them this is a mistake." I looked at him. I looked at the son who had just told me I was no longer family because I smelled like hard work. I looked at the daughter-in-law who mocked my turkey. I looked at Brent and Susan standing on the porch, clutching their glasses in shock as they watched the scene unfold. I leaned my head slightly out the window. "There is no mistake," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly through the cold air. "The owner of the vehicles has revoked your privileges, Darnell. TNB Holding doesn't extend assets to non-employees. And since you just dismissed your father from your family, I assume you've resigned from my support as well." Darnell stood there, speechless. "But Dad, you can't do this. It's Christmas." 10 minutes ago, it was Christmas too, I replied, "right before you closed that door in my face." Tiffany stepped toward the driver, shouting angrily, "You old fool! Giving us these cars was a gift. You can't take back a gift." Mike stepped between Tiffany and his truck. "Ma'am, the title is held by the corporation. It was never a gift. It was a company benefit, and the CEO just canceled it." He pulled a lever on the side of the truck. The hydraulics hummed. And the rear of the Mercedes lifted into the air. Darnell watched helplessly as his status symbol was hoisted off the ground. The second truck was already hooking up the Lexus. The alarm on Tiffany's car began to go off, adding a steady horn to the noise of the diesel engines. Brent walked down to the porch, his face pale. "Thaddeus, this is highly improper. We have guests inside. This is incredibly embarrassing." I looked at the man who had been drinking my wine and eating food bought with my money. "Improper?" I asked. "Brent, living like a king on someone else's dime is improper. Biting the hand that feeds you and expecting it to stroke your ego is improper. Have a pleasant walk home, everyone. Big Mike climbed back into his cab. He sounded the air horn once, loud enough to make Tiffany jump. The trucks began to move. The chains pulled tight, and the Mercedes and the Lexus were hauled down the street, leaving deep tire tracks in the snow and a massive empty space in the driveway. Darnell stood in the snow in his socks, shivering uncontrollably as he watched his lifestyle get towed away. He looked small, he looked defeated, but I knew this was only the beginning. The cars were just the appetizer. The main course hadn't even been served yet. I shifted my truck into drive and pulled away, leaving them out in the cold surrounded by the wreckage of their own vanity. Big Mike didn't climb into his truck right away. He stood on the snow-covered pavement like a judge delivering a verdict, holding a clipboard packed with legal documents against his chest. The commotion brought the rest of the brunch guests out of the warm mansion. They crowded onto the porch, wrapped in cashmere shawls and expensive wool coats, champagne glasses still in hand, as if watching a street performance rather than a family collapse. I saw the way they looked at Darnell. 10 minutes ago, they looked at him with envy. Now their eyes held sharp judgment and curiosity. Darnell shivered violently in his thin velvet jacket, his socks soaked through with freezing slush, paralyzed by embarrassment. He tried to wave Mike off, attempting to dismiss him with a flick of his wrist, as if turning away an intruding servant. "Just go," Darnell rasped, his voice trembling. "We'll settle this later. Take them and go. Stop making a scene." But Big Mike enjoyed the work. He was a man who earned his living with his hands, a man who understood the value of $1, and he had zero patience for the weak pretense Darnell was trying to project. Mike cleared, his throat, a sound like gravel turning in a mixer. He raised his voice so it carried across the front lawn, bouncing off the brick facades of the neighboring houses. "Correction, mister." "More," Mike announced, his breath rising in a white cloud. "There is nothing to settle. The impound order is absolute. I am reading directly from the documentation provided by the asset owner, TNB Holding." He looked straight at the group of guests on the porch, making sure they heard every single syllable. "Due to a breach of contract, the repossession is effective immediately. The user, Darnell Moore, failed to meet the basic requirements of the lease agreement, specifically the clause regarding improper conduct toward the benefactor. Furthermore, the $1 a month lease fee, which was originally a charitable concession by the owner, is now deemed a waste of corporate assets." A whisper rippled through the crowd on the porch. I saw a woman in a fur coat lean over, covering her mouth with her hand as she whispered something to her husband. Darnell's face turned a pale gray. $1 a month. The secret was out. He had told everyone he bought those cars with his performance bonuses as a marketing genius. He had told Brent he paid cash to avoid high interest rates. Now everyone knew he was driving a charity ride. He was parading around on his father's generosity, and he had just driven that generosity straight into the wall of his own arrogance. "This is a lie!" Tiffany screamed, running down the driveway, her high heels slipping on the ice. She looked somewhat unhinged, her perfect hair coming undone in the wind. "My husband bought these cars. He's a big deal in this city. You're just a thief trying to scam us. I'm calling the police." She clumsily pulled out her phone, her acrylic nails tapping wildly on the screen. "I'm going to have you arrested. I'm going to throw you in prison for grand theft auto." Big Mike simply offered a cold, professional smile. "Go right ahead, ma'am. Call the police." I've got all day. He leaned against the grill of the tow truck, crossing his arms and waiting. Darnell tried to grab Tiffany's arm to stop her. Tiffany, don't, he pleaded, panic filling his eyes. Don't call the police. We can handle this. But she shoved him off. She was driven by the righteous indignation of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. She dialed 911, screaming into the receiver, demanding immediate backup for an armed robbery in progress. I watched from inside my truck. I took a sip of warm coffee from my thermos. This was all part of the plan. I knew Tiffany. I knew her sense of entitlement was a weapon that would eventually turn against her. I waited. The guests on the porch looked uncomfortable now, shifting nervously, checking their watches, wondering if they could slip back to their own cars without being noticed. But the tow trucks completely blocked the driveway. They were trapped in this spectacle of Darnell's humiliation. 5 minutes later, a patrol car rounded the corner, with its sirens blaring. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters. Tiffany ran toward them, pointing a trembling finger at Big Mike. "Arrest him!" she screamed. "He's stealing my Lexus. He's stealing my husband's Mercedes. He threatened us." The older officer, a tired-looking sergeant, raised a hand to quiet her. "Calm down, ma'am. Who do these vehicles belong to?" "Use," Darnell said, stepping forward, trying to reclaim some of his lost dignity. "Mine. They're mine." Without a word, Big Mike handed the clipboard to the sergeant. The officer flipped through the documents. He looked at the registration. He looked at the title. He looked at the repossession order signed by a judge. Then he looked at Darnell. "Sir," the officer said, his voice flat and unimpressed. "According to these documents, you are not the owner. TNB Holding is the registered owner. You are listed as a permitted user. This is the revocation document signed by the CEO this morning." The officer pointed to the signature at the bottom of the page. Darnell glanced at it. He saw the name Thaddeus Moore. He raised his head and looked at me across the street. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just lost the cars. He had been exposed as a liar right in front of the law. "I don't understand," Brent said, stepping down from the porch. He walked over to the police, his expensive shoes crunching in the snow. "Darnell, you told me the title was in your name. You told me you transferred these assets to your personal portfolio last quarter." Darnell stammered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I intended to. It's a tax issue, Brent. It's a complex corporate structuring matter." The officer handed the clipboard back to Mike. "This is a civil matter, sir. The paperwork is in order. These gentlemen have the right to take the vehicles. Please step aside and let them finish, or I'll have to cite you for obstructing an active repossession." Tiffany gasped loudly. "You are completely useless," she spat at the officer. "Do you know who my father is?" The officer looked at her with an expression that suggested he wouldn't care if her father were the Pope. "Please step aside, ma'am." Big Mike gave the signal. The diesel engines roared once more, and the metal chains groaned under the tension. The Mercedes S-Class, Darnell's pride, his shield, his mask, was lifted entirely off the ground. It hung there, swaying slightly in the winter wind, like a heavy deadweight of steel and leather. Then came the Lexus. The tow trucks slowly backed out, pulling their captured prizes toward the street. Brent looked at Darnell. The admiration in his eyes from 10 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a cold, hard calculation. He was a man who valued success, and the man he was looking at now had just been exposed as a fraud. "You lied," Brent said quietly. His voice cut right through the engine noise. You lied about the cars. What else did you lie about? Darnell didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stood in the snow, shivering, watching his status symbols disappear around the corner. The whispers from the guests on the porch grew louder. I saw Susan, Tiffany's mother, clutch her handbag, turn around, and head back into the house, her face drawn tight with embarrassment. The driveway was empty. The show was over. Big Mike sounded his horn one last time, a final nod to his boss, and drove away. The police officer got back into his patrol car and left, leaving Darnell and Tiffany standing in the slush, surrounded by the ruins of their reputation. I shifted my truck into drive. I released the brake. My tires crunched against the ice. I drove past the house at a crawl. I rolled my window all the way down. The cold air bit at my face, but I didn't flinch. I drove past Tiffany, who was weeping with her hands over her face. I drove past Brent, who was staring at the empty spot where the Mercedes used to be. Then I pulled up level with Darnell. He raised his head. His eyes were red, filled with shock and a growing sense of dread. He looked at me, expecting me to stop, expecting me to roll down the window and yell, lecture him, or maybe offer him a way out. He was expecting the father who always rescued him to save him one more time. I stopped the truck for half a second. I turned my head and locked eyes with him. I didn't say a single word. I didn't frown. I didn't smile. I just looked at him with the absolute indifference of a complete stranger. I let him see that the place once reserved for his father was now total emptiness. I let him feel the weight of our silence, a silence he created and that I was now enforcing. He took a step toward the truck, reaching out a hand. "Dad," he whispered. I stepped on the gas. The truck moved forward, steady and unforgiving. I watched him in the side mirror, shrinking into the distance, a small dark figure standing alone in the snow of an empty driveway. He was on his own now, and I had a meeting with a bank manager to make sure it stayed that way. I drove the rusty Ford back to the south side of the city. The neighborhoods here were different. The driveways were cracked, and the houses stood close together, like shoulders huddled for warmth in the cold. My apartment was on the second floor of a brick duplex I bought 30 years ago. It was simple. The carpet was worn, and the furniture was older than my son, but I owned it outright. It was mine. Darnell hated this place. He called it a dungeon. He said it smelled like stale memories and stagnation. He didn't understand that this apartment was the command center of an empire he didn't even know existed. I walked into my small office and locked the door. I pushed aside a painting of a lighthouse on the wall, revealing a heavy steel wall safe. It was an old mechanical model, the dial clicking satisfyingly under my fingers. I turned the combination left to 20, right to 10, left to 5. The heavy door opened with a well-lubricated metallic groan. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or gold bars. Instead, there was a thick, leather-bound ledger, the Black Book. I sat at the desk and opened it. The pages were filled with my handwriting, columns of numbers and dates, documenting every single dollar I had poured into Darnell's life over the past decade. The down payment on the mansion, the seed money for his struggling marketing firm, the monthly allowance disguised as dividends from a non-existent trust fund. The grand total at the bottom of the last page was staggering: $2.5 million. That money was earned from laying pipe beneath the city streets, dealing with city councils, and quietly buying up distressed properties when no one was paying attention. I wasn't just a retired laborer. I was TNB Holding. I owned the commercial plaza where Darnell bought his coffee. I owned the warehouse district where he claimed to have an office. I owned the ground he walked on, even as he treated me like dirt beneath his shoes. I closed the ledger. The time for accounting was over. The time for liquidation had begun. I booted up my computer. It was a high-end machine with 3 monitors, a stark contrast to the rest of the room. I logged into the corporate banking portal, the screens lighting up with various accounts and balances. I navigated to the sub-account labeled Darnell Lifestyle. This was the credit line I had set up for him to maintain his appearances. It had a limit of $50,000 a month, and he usually maxed it out. I checked the active cards linked to the account. There were 2, his Visa Platinum and Tiffany Centurion card. They flaunted those cards around town like badges of honor, never knowing I was the one paying the bill every 30 days. My mouse cursor hovered over the button labeled Suspend All Services. It was a small red rectangle on the screen, a simple digital switch. Yet, pressing it felt heavier than lifting a steel beam. This was the lifeline. This was the blood supply to their false life. If I clicked this, I wasn't just cutting off their money, I was cutting off their entire identity. I remembered Darnell when he was a young boy, asking me for a few dollars for the ice cream truck. I remembered his smile. Then I remembered the door slamming in my face half an hour ago. I remembered Tiffany mocking my turkey. I remembered Brent looking at me like I was the hired help. My finger pressed down on the mouse. Click. A dialog box popped up. Are you sure you want to suspend all linked cards and freeze assets? This action is immediate and irreversible. This time, I didn't hesitate. I hit enter. The screen refreshed. Status: suspended. The text turned bright red. It was done. The invisible stream of wealth keeping Darnell's illusion alive had just run dry. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't guilt. It was power. The cold, absolute power of a man who finally decided to stop holding up the sky for people who despised him. 5 miles away, in the dining room of the Oakview mansion, the tension was suffocating. The guests were still whispering about the tow trucks, but Tiffany was trying to salvage the brunch. She had ordered the catering staff to serve the main course early. It was an extravagant meal. Lobster tails, imported cheeses, truffle pasta, and vintage champagne. The head of the catering team, a man named Pierre, whom I knew personally because he rented his commercial kitchen space from me, approached Darnell. Pierre looked nervous. He had seen the cars get towed. He smelled trouble. "Mr. Moore," Pierre said cautiously, "before we open the champagne, I need to settle the final bill. For events exceeding $10,000, it's company policy." Darnell adjusted his jacket, trying to regain his composure. "Of course, Pierre. No problem." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Visa Platinum card. He handed it over with a flourish, his voice loud enough for Brent and Susan to hear. "Put it on this, and add a 20% tip for the trouble earlier." Pierre took the card and inserted it into the portable card reader. The machine chimed, processing. The room fell silent. Everyone was watching. Darnell smiled at Brent. "Just a minor misunderstanding with the leasing company, Brent. We're handling it." The machine emitted a harsh, low-pitched buzz. Transaction declined. Pierre frowned. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Moore. The card didn't go through." Darnell laughed nervously. "That's impossible. That card has no limit. Try it again. Maybe the chip is dirty." He wiped the card against his velvet sleeve and handed it back. Pierre tried again. He held the machine up, trying to get a better signal. He inserted the card. He waited. Buzz, transaction declined. Response code 05. Contact issuing bank. Darnell's smile froze. Here, use Tiffany's card. He snapped his fingers at his wife. Tiffany rummaged through her handbag and pulled out the heavy Centurion card. She slapped it onto the table. This one never fails. It's invite only. Pierre took the card. He swiped it. The machine didn't even pause to process. It chimed instantly. Card blocked. Retain immediately. Pierre looked at the screen, then looked back at Darnell. His expression hardened. Mr. Moore, both cards are declined. The bank instruction says to confiscate. What? But? Darnell stood up, yelling. This is insane. My father must have messed up the transfer. Do you have another form of payment? Pierre asked, all politeness gone from his voice. The total is $15,400. Darnell patted his pockets. He looked at Tiffany. She shook her head, panic wide in her eyes. I don't have cash, Darnell. Who carries cash? Susan asked. Pierre turned to the in-laws. Brent, perhaps you could cover this for now. Brent's face turned deep red. I left my wallet at the hotel. We assumed Darnell was hosting. Pierre nodded slowly. I see. He turned to his staff. Pack it up. Excuse me? Tiffany screamed. Everyone is still hungry. You can't just leave. We're not leaving, ma'am, Pierre said. We're taking the food with us. No payment, no service. Boys, clear the tables. The catering staff descended like locusts. They were not gentle. They snatched lobster platters right out from under the guests' noses. They re-corked open champagne bottles. They scraped the truffle pasta back into metal trays. The sound of clattering silverware and stacking plates filled the room, drowning out the holiday music. It was a scene of total humiliation. The guests watched in horror as their lunch was repossessed, bite by bite. Darnell stood helpless, watching the feast vanish. He looked at the empty tables, then at the confused, angry faces of his guests. I'm leaving. A woman in a fur coat announced, standing up. This is a complete farce. Me too, her husband agreed. Darnell, this is embarrassing. The guests began filing out one by one. They didn't say thank you. They didn't say Merry Christmas. They grabbed their coats and fled the scene. Brent and Susan stood shivering near the doorway. Their driver had been dismissed because Darnell promised to drive them back in the Mercedes. The Mercedes that was currently parked in an impound lot across town. Darnell, Brent said, his voice trembling with anger. Call us a ride. We're going back to the Four Seasons. Darnell pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen frantically. Then he looked up, his face pale. My ride-share account. It's linked to that credit card. It won't let me book a car. Susan let out a soft sob. We're stuck. We're trapped in this house with no food and no car. You're going to have to call a cab, Brent said with disgust. An old-fashioned taxicab. And you're going to have to pay cash, Darnell, because I am certainly not paying for my own rescue. I watched the GPS tracker on my computer screen. I saw the dot representing Darnell's phone pacing back and forth in the hallway. I watched the catering van leave the property. I leaned back in the quiet of my apartment. The silence here was peaceful. But the silence in that mansion must have been deafening. Plan Z was in full effect, and I hadn't even served the eviction notice yet. The stillness of the morning after Christmas was a luxury I hadn't enjoyed in years. I sat in the worn velvet armchair in my living room, drinking black coffee from a chipped mug that Betty had picked up at a flea market 20 years ago. Sunbeams cut through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was peaceful, quiet, the calm before the second storm. At 8:30 sharp, the knocking began. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a heavy, violent pounding that rattled the door frame. I didn't flinch. I didn't rush. I took another slow sip of coffee, savoring the bitterness, and placed the mug on the coaster. I walked to the door, my boots heavy against the hardwood floor. I knew exactly who was waiting, on the other side. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Darnell and Tiffany stood on my porch, shivering in the biting cold. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck. Darnell was still wearing yesterday's velvet jacket, but it was crumpled and stained. His expensive dress shoes were caked in gray slush. Tiffany looked even worse. Her mascara was smeared around her eyes, like war paint, and she was wrapped in a thin coat that did little against the freezing wind. They had no car. I caught a glimpse of a yellow taxi pulling away from the curb. They had paid cash just to come here and scream at me. Before I could say hello, Tiffany pushed past me and barged into the hallway. Her perfume had gone sour, mixed with the sharp scent of desperation. "You crazy old man!" she screeched, her voice cracking. "Do you have any idea what you did to us? You ruined my first Christmas as a wife. You humiliated my parents." My mother had to ride in a taxi, Thaddeus. A taxi that smelled like stale smoke. Darnell followed her inside, kicking the door shut behind him. There was no shame in the way he looked at me. He stared with a terrifying sense of entitlement, his eyes bloodshot. "Fix this, Dad," Darnell demanded. He paced the narrow living room like a caged animal, kicking the edge of my rug. "Call the bank. Call the leasing company. Tell them it was a computer glitch. I have clients calling me. My LinkedIn premium subscription was declined this morning. Do you know how embarrassing that is?" I leaned against the wall and crossed my arms, watching them invade my home. They weren't here to apologize. They weren't here to ask for forgiveness. They were here because the ATM had stopped spitting out money, and they wanted to kick the machine until it started working again. "I'm not fixing anything," I said calmly. "The glitch has been corrected, Darnell. The mistake was funding a lifestyle you couldn't afford in the first place." Tiffany turned around, her face twisted in a sneer. "Oh, save us your moral high ground speech. We know what this is really about." "You're jealous." "Jealous?" I raised an eyebrow. "Yes, jealous," she spat. "You hate that Darnell loves me. You hate that he moved up into my world, a world of class and refinement that you could never understand. You're just a bitter, lonely old man trying to control him because you have nothing. You saw my parents yesterday. You saw how much Darnell respects them, and you couldn't take it. You wanted to punish him for marrying into a family with real standards." I looked at her, this woman who thought class was nothing more than a brand logo on a handbag. Darnell stepped forward, pointing a finger directly in my face. "She's right, Dad. This is petty. You're punishing me because I moved forward, because I upgraded. But you can't just cut off my money. That money isn't even yours." I stared at him. "What did you say?" "That money," Darnell shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "The trust fund, the allowance. That was Mom's money. That was her life insurance policy. Those were her savings. You're just the executor. You have no right to withhold my inheritance. You're keeping my money, Thaddeus. You're taking my mother's legacy to feed your own ego." The air in the room grew heavy. Mentioning Betty was a mistake, a fatal tactical error. Darnell had built a fantasy inside his head. He had convinced himself that his father, the man in work boots, was incapable of building wealth. He believed the money came from some magical pot of gold left by his mother, a woman who had worked 30 years as a school librarian. I walked over to the steel safe built into the wall. I turned the dial left and right. Darnell watched me with hungry eyes, expecting me to pull out stacks of cash. Instead, I retrieved a thin paper folder and tossed it onto the coffee table. It slid across the surface and stopped right in front of him. "Open it," I commanded. Darnell frowned. He picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside was no cash. It was a copy of Betty's death certificate and the final probate documents from 10 years ago. "Read the bottom line," I ordered. Darnell's eyes scanned the page, narrowing. "Estate value, $2,400. He looked up, confused. "This is a typo. Mom had millions. We lived in that house. We had those cars. Your mother had $2,000 in her checking account when she passed, Darnell," I said, my voice cold as ice. "She was a good woman, but she wasn't wealthy. She didn't leave you a trust fund. She left you her recipes and her love." "Then where did the money come from?" Darnell whispered, the paper trembling in his hand. "It came from me," I said. "It came from hard work, Darnell. It came from waking up at 4 in the morning for 50 years. It came from buying swampland when everyone called me crazy and selling it to developers a decade later. It came from TNB Holding, Thaddeus and Betty. I earned that money. Every dollar you spent on suits, champagne, and cars came from these hands." I held up my hands, palms turned outward, showing him the deep calluses and scars. "That allowance wasn't an inheritance," I continued, stepping closer to him. "It was a paycheck. I treated you like an employee, Darnell. I paid you to be my son. I invested in you, hoping you would grow into a partner. But I audited the books yesterday, and I realized I've been pouring capital into a failing venture." Darnell stumbled back, hitting the edge of the sofa. "No, that's a lie. You're a laborer. You lay pipes." "I owned the company that laid the pipes," I corrected him. "And as CEO, I'm making a personnel decision." "You're fired, Darnell. Your position as my dependent has been terminated for gross misconduct, effective immediately." Tiffany let out a sharp, nervous laugh. "You expect us to believe this? You're lying. You're just trying to scare us." "Darnell, tell him he's lying." Darnell looked at me, then at the small apartment, the worn carpet, and the old furniture. He couldn't reconcile the man standing in front of him with the vast sums of money he had spent. "Get out," I said. "No," Darnell said, his face hardening again. "Not until you turn those cars back on. I don't care where the money came from. I have my reputation, Dad. You can't do this to me. I'm not leaving until you fix this." He sat down in my armchair, crossing his arms like a defiant child. Tiffany sat next to him, glaring at me. "We're staying right here," she threatened, "until you come to your senses." I looked at them, invading the only sanctuary I had left. "Fine," I said. "Stay as long as you like." I turned around and walked into the kitchen. I opened the back door leading to the small yard. It was freezing outside. A heavy-duty garden hose was coiled around the spigot, fitted with a high-pressure brass nozzle I had used to wash salt off my truck's undercarriage. I turned the valve, water surging through the rubber hose. I tested the nozzle, sending a jet of icy water, smacking loudly against the fence. I dragged the hose through the kitchen and into the hallway. Darnell looked up. "What are you doing?" I'm clearing the trash out of my house, I said, and squeezed the trigger. The high-pressure stream hit Darnell right in the chest. It wasn't a trickle. It was a freezing blast that soaked his velvet jacket in seconds. He screamed, leaping out of the chair. "Hey, stop! That water is freezing." I swung the nozzle toward Tiffany. She shrieked, diving behind the sofa. I said, "Get out!" I roared, advancing on them. I blasted them again, the jet relentless, soaking the carpet, drenching their clothes, misting the air with an icy spray that stung like needles. Darnell slipped on the wet floor, scrambling frantically to escape the water. He looked like a drowned rat. He grabbed Tiffany's hand and dragged her toward the door. "You're crazy," he yelled, shielding his face. "You're completely insane." I drove them all the way to the threshold, not stopping, until they stumbled onto the porch, slipping on the ice outside. Their expensive clothes were ruined, their dignity washed away completely. I slammed the door and locked it. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, listening to the water dripping from the walls. My living room was a mess, my rug soaked, but the air felt cleaner than it had in a long time. I walked back to the kitchen, shut off the spigot, and grabbed some old towels. I had a mess to clean up, but for the first time in a while, I didn't mind the work. For the next 2 hours, I dried the hallway. The silence in the apartment was heavy, but it was mine. I sat at the kitchen table, finished my cold coffee, and waited for the next move. I knew my son. Darnell was not a man who accepted defeat smoothly. He was the type to escalate until he ran full speed into a wall he couldn't climb over. At noon, the doorbell rang again. This time, there was no pounding, just a firm, confident press of the button. I walked over and opened the door. Darnell was there, dressed in a new suit that looked off the rack. Standing beside him was a man I didn't recognize, young, wearing a shiny suit, holding a briefcase made of vinyl instead of real leather. He had the hungry look of an attorney who advertised on bus benches. Tiffany stood behind them, arms crossed, a smug expression on her face. "Mr. Moore," the young man said, extending a hand that I ignored. "I am Barry Lipschitz, representing your son, Darnell Moore. We are here to serve you with an intent to file for personal injury regarding the hose incident this morning. Furthermore, we are filing for an emergency injunction to restore access to the financial assets you have unlawfully frozen." Darnell stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "You messed up, Dad. You assaulted us. Barry says that's a serious offense. Elder abuse in reverse. By the time the judge is done with you, this duplex will belong to us. You have to turn the cards back on. This is financial coercion." I looked at Barry. I looked at Darnell. I didn't say a single word. I simply stepped back, opened the door wider, and invited them into the damp hallway. "Come on in," I said. Darnell smirked at Tiffany. "See? He's scared." They walked into the living room, completely oblivious to the man sitting in the shadows of the dining nook, eating a sandwich. Reggie wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up. At 6'4", he radiated pure authority, wearing a charcoal three-piece suit worth more than Barry's car. He didn't smile or offer his hand. He adjusted his silk tie and stepped into the light. "Gentlemen," Reggie said, his deep voice sounding like distant thunder, "before you file any motions regarding personal injury, I suggest you review the state's castle doctrine. Mr. Moore was defending his home against trespassers who refused to leave after being repeatedly asked to do so. As for the financial assets, there are no assets to restore. Gifts are revocable, allowances are discretionary. Barry froze. He recognized Reggie. Everyone in the legal community knew Reginald Moss. He was the apex predator who ate other sharks for breakfast. "Mr. Moss," Barry stammered, "I didn't realize you were counsel on this matter." "I am not just counsel," Reggie said. "I am the architect of the trust, and I am here to discuss the property at 42 Oakview Drive." Darnell laughed nervously. "What about my house? That's my house." Reggie reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. He placed it on the coffee table. "Do you recognize this signature, Darnell?" Reggie asked. Darnell glanced at it. "Sure. That's the tax document Dad had me sign 3 years ago to protect the asset." Reggie shook his head. "No, son. That is a lease agreement. A standard residential lease contract. Look at line 4. Tenant agrees to pay monthly rent in the amount of $1. Darnell frowned. "Right, $1. Dad did that so I wouldn't have to pay gift taxes. It was smart." "It's a lease contract," Reggie corrected. "A month-to-month tenancy, revocable at will." "Do you know what at will means, Darnell?" "It means the landlord can terminate the lease at any time, for any reason or no reason at all, provided proper notice is given." "But I own it," Darnell insisted, his voice rising in pitch. "Dad bought it for me. It was a wedding gift." "Show me the deed," Reggie said, extending his hand. "Show me the title. Show me a single piece of paper that says Darnell Moore owns anything other than the clothes on his back." Darnell froze. He turned to look at me. "Dad, tell him." I sat down in my armchair. "You wanted to play the big man, Darnell. You wanted to tell your friends you were a real estate mogul. So I let you. I let you sign the lease for $1 so you could feel like a king. But you never read the fine print. You never asked why TNB Holding was listed as the landlord. You signed because you saw a free ride." Reggie tapped the paper. "Here is your reality check. You are a tenant who breached the behavioral clauses of his lease. A tenant who has just become extraordinarily expensive to maintain." Barry, the cheap lawyer, closed his briefcase and stepped back. "Darnell, you told me you had the deed. You told me it was in your name." "I thought it was," Darnell muttered. Reggie pulled out a second document, crisp and fresh. He handed it to Darnell. "This is a notice of rent adjustment," Reggie announced. "Effective immediately. The special family discount of $1 per month has been revoked due to the termination of the familial relationship. The rent is now adjusted to fair market value for a 6,000 square foot estate in an exclusive, gated community." Darnell read the paper, his hands beginning to shake, making the paper rustle softly. $8,000, he choked out. $8,000 a month plus utilities, Reggie added, plus landscaping and HOA fees, which Thaddeus previously covered as a courtesy. That courtesy has expired. Tiffany snatched the paper out of Darnell's hand, her eyes scanning the figures. The color drained from her face. $8,000? We can't afford $8,000 a month, Darnell. We don't even have $8,000 in the bank. Darnell looked at me. Dad, this is impossible. You know I don't make that kind of money. My salary is... Your salary is irrelevant, Reggie interrupted. You have two choices, Mr. Moore. Option 1. You pay the first month's rent plus a $16,000 security deposit within 24 hours. Option 2. You vacate the property within 30 days. 30 days, Darnell shouted. Where are we supposed to go? We have furniture. We have a life. That is not my client's concern, Reggie said coldly. If you do not vacate in 30 days, we will file for eviction, and an adverse eviction record will make it nearly impossible for you to rent a studio apartment in this city." Tiffany whipped around to face Darnell, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and revulsion. "You told me the house was paid off. You told me your father gave it to us. You lied to me." Darnell reached out to her. "Baby, listen to me. Don't touch me," she hissed, backing away from him. She looked at the apartment, then at me, and finally back at Darnell. "You're broke. You're actually broke. You have nothing." She wasn't looking at her husband anymore. She was looking at a stranger who had tricked her into a life of poverty. The illusion of wealth Darnell had used to win her over had just evaporated in my living room, leaving behind only the smell of wet carpet and the cold, hard truth. Barry cleared his throat. "I think I'll be taking my leave. I don't do landlord-tenant disputes. Good luck, Darnell." He walked out, leaving the door wide open. Reggie gathered his papers. "The clock is ticking, sir, ma'am. 30 days, or a check for $24,000 by tomorrow morning." I stood up, walked to the door, and held it open. "You heard the gentleman," I said. "Get out of my house. And Darnell?" He looked at me, his eyes hollow. "Don't slam the door on your way out. It's impolite." They stepped out into the cold afternoon. Tiffany walked quickly, putting distance between herself and Darnell. Darnell walked slowly, head down, shoulders slumped, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. But it wasn't the world. It was just the weight of his own lies finally crushing him. I closed the door gently and locked it. One problem down. But the war wasn't over. Tiffany still had an outlet, and she was about to use it. I sat in my dark kitchen, illuminated only by the blue glow of my tablet screen. On the display, my daughter-in-law, Tiffany, was crying. It was a masterclass in performance. She was sitting on the edge of a bed in what looked like a cramped hotel room. The lighting was dim, designed to cast shadows under her eyes to make her look exhausted and vulnerable. Darnell sat beside her, head bowed, looking like a broken man. The live viewer count in the corner of the screen was climbing rapidly. 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 strangers tuning in to watch a public attack on my character. "Guys, I didn't want to do this," Tiffany whimpered, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. "We tried to handle this privately, but we have nowhere else to turn. We're practically homeless right now. My husband's father," she paused, wiping away a stray tear. "He threw us out on Christmas Day because we refused to let him control us anymore." She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes wide and pleading. "This has been going on for months. He would show up unannounced. He would criticize my clothes, the way I spent money. He made me feel unsafe in my own home. And when Darnell finally stood up to him, when Darnell finally said no to the toxicity, Thaddeus snapped. He cut off our bank accounts. He took our cars, he left us on the street with nothing just to teach us a lesson. Guys, this is pure financial abuse." Darnell gave a slow nod, keeping his eyes on the floor. "Yeah," he muttered quietly. "My dad, he isn't the man I thought he was. He has a lot of anger, a lot of resentment toward Tiffany and her family because they come from a different background. He hated seeing us happy." The comment section scrolled past so fast the text became a blur. "Monster, call the police on him. Set up a GoFundMe. I hope that old man suffers." Someone posted my address while another shared a Google Maps image of my duplex. The online mob had been summoned, and they were out for blood. I watched Tiffany sob onto Darnell's shoulder. I watched my son pat her back, wearing a mask of tragic nobility. They were painting a picture of a young couple persecuted by a bitter, hateful, authoritarian father. It was a narrative designed to trigger every protective instinct in their audience. A lie so bold and completely detached from reality that I almost admired the strategy. They knew they couldn't beat me in court, and they knew they couldn't beat me financially. So they were trying to destroy me in the court of public opinion, where facts didn't matter and feelings passed for truth. I turned off the tablet. Silence returned. But the room felt colder. They had weaponized their own failure, turning their eviction into a crusade. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. It was empty, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Darnell had just painted a target on my back and handed the weapon to the internet. The first rock came crashing through the front window at 2 in the morning. It sounded like an explosion. Glass shattered inward, raining fragments onto the living room rug I had just dried. I was sitting in my armchair, a baseball bat resting across my lap, lightly napping. I didn't jump. I simply opened my eyes and tightened my grip on the wood. A brick landed heavily near the television, a piece of notebook paper wrapped around it with a rubber band. I stepped over the shattered glass toward the window, staying in the shadows with my back against the wall. I peered through the blinds just in time to see a sedan speeding away, its taillights disappearing around the corner. I picked up the brick and unfolded the paper. "Leave her alone, you sick old man," the scrawled handwriting read. I looked at the jagged hole in the window. The winter wind whistled through the opening, turning the room freezing cold. This was the reality Darnell had unleashed. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew how this played out. He was counting on the mob to do what he was too weak to do himself. To break me, to intimidate me into submission, to make me open my checkbook just to make the nightmare stop. For the next 3 days, I lived under siege. Cars slowed down as they passed my house. People shouted insults from the sidewalk. Someone spray-painted "Predator" across my garage door in red paint. When I went to the grocery store, the young cashier girl I had watched grow up refused to look me in the eye, practically tossing the receipt at me with trembling hands. The rumors spread like wildfire. I wasn't just a tough landlord anymore. I was framed as a dangerous menace to society. Reggie called me on the second day. "Thaddeus, you need to make a statement," he urged. "We need to issue a cease and desist letter. We need to sue for defamation." In the eyes of these people, silence looks like guilt. "No, Reggie," I said, sweeping up glass from the porch. "Silence isn't guilt. Silence is patience. If I argue, I give them oxygen. If I sue, I look defensive. I need them to think they're winning. I need them to feel safe enough to make a mistake." "But you're in danger, Thaddeus," Reggie argued. "They're putting your information online. They're coming to your house." "Let them come," I said. I upgraded the security system this morning. 4K cameras with audio, motion sensors, reinforced deadbolts. I'm not a victim, Reggie. I'm a fortress. And fortresses don't complain about the weather. They just endure the storm. I didn't go on social media to defend myself. I didn't post the receipts showing the millions I had spent on them. Instead, I picked up the phone and dialed a number belonging to a man named Silas. Silas wasn't a lawyer or a banker. He was a former police detective who had lost his badge because he was too good at finding things people wanted hidden. He operated out of a basement office that smelled of cigar smoke and old paper. "Silas," I said when he answered, "I've got a job for you. I heard you're famous, Thaddeus." Silas chuckled, his voice dry. I saw the video. Your daughter-in-law has a real future in acting. I need a background check, I said, ignoring the joke. Go deep, not on Darnell. I know his sins. I need you to look into Brent and Susan Miller, Tiffany's parents. The wealthy in-laws? Silas asked. Why? They look squeaky clean. That's the problem, I said. They look too clean. They fly first class, but take taxicabs home when things get tough. They wear Rolex, but didn't offer to pay the catering bill when their daughter was embarrassed. Wealthy people have pride, Silas. If they really had money, Brent would have thrown down a credit card just to humiliate me. He didn't. He backed off. You think they're faking it? Silas asked, interested now. I think my son married into a house of cards, I said. Darnell thinks they're his ticket into the elite. He thinks they're backing him up right now. But I have a feeling they're sinking just as fast as he is. I want to know everything. Bankruptcies, liens, lawsuits. Check the California property records. Find out who actually owns their vineyard. Consider it done, Silas said. Give me 48 hours. I hung up the phone and looked at the brick sitting on the coffee table. Darnell thought he was playing a game of reputation. He thought, if he made me look bad enough, I would break. He didn't understand that I wasn't fighting for my reputation. I didn't care what strangers thought of me. I was fighting for the truth, and the truth is a slow-acting poison. I walked to the window and taped a piece of cardboard over the hole. The wind was still blowing, but I felt a fire burning inside me. They wanted to play the victims? Fine. I would let them set the stage and turn on the spotlights. Then, while the whole world was watching, I would pull the floor out from right under their feet. The silence in the house was no longer lonely. It was full of anticipation. The trap was set, and all that remained was for it to snap shut. Silas sat in the shadows of my cramped kitchen, his face lit only by the glowing tip of his cigar. He didn't smile as I poured him a glass of whiskey. He simply slid a thick manila envelope across my scratched wooden table. It landed with a heavy thud that sounded like a final sentence. I picked it up. My hands were steady, but a familiar dread churned in my stomach. Unclasping the metal fastener, I dumped the contents onto the table. It wasn't a criminal record. It was a financial autopsy of the Miller family. I picked up the first document, a foreclosure notice on a bank in Napa Valley from 4 years ago. I picked up the next, a Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing listing debts, totaling $3 million. I scanned the credit report, a sea of red flags and defaulted payments. Then I looked at the employment history. Brent Miller wasn't a vineyard owner. He was a tasting room manager who had been fired for stealing inventory. Susan Miller hadn't held a job in 20 years. They didn't own a sprawling coastal estate. They lived in a rented 2-bedroom unit in an apartment building whose glory days were long gone. The truth hit me like a physical blow. My son hadn't married into wealth. He had married illusion. Darnell thought he was climbing the social ladder, but he had actually tethered himself to a sinking ship. Brent and Susan hadn't come for Christmas to celebrate. They had come to nest like parasites because they had run out of options. And Darnell, driving his leased Mercedes and living in a mansion maintained by my money, must have looked like the ultimate mark. They were parasites feeding on a host who was himself living off someone else. It was such a pathetic cycle that I almost laughed. Almost. Silas took a sip of his drink. They're completely broke, Thaddeus, he said, his voice gravelly. They have $40 in their joint checking account. They maxed out their last credit card just to buy the plane tickets here. They're living off the cash Darnell gives them, which means they're living off your money, laundered through your son's delusion. I stared at the papers. This was why Brent didn't pay the catering bill. This was why they took a taxi instead of calling an Uber. This was why Tiffany was so desperate to hold on to that house. It wasn't just about status. It was about survival. They had nothing. And now, because of me, Darnell had nothing either. Just as I was staring at the evidence of their poverty, a knock came at the door. It wasn't the pounding of an angry tenant, but a soft, hesitant tap. I gestured for Silas to keep quiet. I gathered the papers, stuffed them back into the envelope, and hid them under a newspaper before walking to the door. Darnell stood on the porch, looking terrible. His eyes were sunken, and he hadn't shaved in 3 days. He wasn't wearing a suit this time, just jeans and a hoodie, looking more like the boy I used to take fishing than the man who had slammed a door in my face. He didn't yell or make demands. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets, shivering in the cold wind. "Can I come in, Dad?" he asked, his voice raspy. "It's cold out here." I stepped aside. He walked in and stood in the hallway, not daring to enter the living room where I had sprayed him with the hose. He stared at the floor. "I know you're angry," he whispered. "I know I messed up. I know I said things I shouldn't have, but you have to understand the pressure I was under. Tiffany's parents expect a certain lifestyle. I just wanted you to be proud of me, Dad. I wanted you to look at me and see a success." I leaned against the wall with my arms crossed, making no move to offer him coffee or invite him to sit down. "You have a strange way of showing it, Darnell," I said. "Throwing your father out on Christmas isn't usually a sign of success." He raised his head, eyes filled with tears. "I know, and I'm sorry. I really am. But I came here because things have changed. I'm not asking for myself. I can handle being broke. I can handle the humiliation. But I can't let an innocent person suffer." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Darnell took a deep breath, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to me with a trembling hand. "Tiffany is pregnant," he whispered. "You're going to be a grandfather." The world seemed to freeze. The anger, the sense of betrayal, the cold calculations of my revenge. Everything stood still in that single second. A grandchild. A baby to carry on the Moore name, a piece of Betty living on in this world. I felt a crack form in the stone wall I had built around my heart. Looking at Darnell, I saw my son for the first time in days. I saw the fear of a father who couldn't provide, the desperation of a man trying to protect his family. I took the paper. It was a printout of an ultrasound scan, a grainy black and white image showing a tiny gray shape amidst a sea of static noise. "She's 8 weeks along," Darnell said, tears running down his cheeks. "We just found out. That's why she was so emotional, why she was so frantic about the house. She's nesting, Dad. She's terrified. We're going to have a baby, and we're homeless. We don't have a car, and we don't have money to see a doctor." I stared at the image, tracing my thumb over the glossy paper. A grandchild. I imagined holding a baby again, teaching a child to fish or read. I imagined redemption. Maybe this was the wake-up call Darnell needed. Maybe fatherhood would change him the way it had changed me. I looked up at Darnell. He was watching me with an almost desperate intensity. "Please, Dad," he begged. "Not for me, for the baby. Don't let your grandchild start life in a motel. Just restore the allowance. Just for a few months until I can get back on my feet." I felt my resolve crumbling. I was an old man, lonely and longing for a legacy far more than justice. I walked to my desk and picked up my checkbook, feeling the weight of the pen in my hand. Just one check, I told myself. Just enough for them to find a safe place, just enough to ensure the baby is healthy. I opened the checkbook, but as I prepared to write the date, a thought hit me, a small, persistent voice in the back of my mind. It was the voice of Thaddeus the businessman, not Thaddeus the father. Trust, but verify. I paused and looked at the ultrasound image again. Something about the header felt off. It looked clean, too clean. Darnell, I said, slowly setting the pen down. Which doctor is she seeing? Darnell blinked. Dr. Evans at the downtown clinic. He's the best. I knew Dr. Evans. He was a good man who had treated Betty years ago when we suspected a health scare. I pulled out my phone. Good, I said. I'll call him. I'll pay for her prenatal care directly. I'll set up an account with the clinic right now. Darnell's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of panic flashing behind his tears. You don't need to do that, Dad. Just write the check. It's easier that way. I don't want to. Bother the doctor, he's busy. I dialed the number and put it on speaker. Darnell took a step forward, reaching out to grab the phone. Dad, stop. You're embarrassing me. The receptionist answered. City Medical Clinic. How can I help you? Hello, this is Thaddeus Moore, I said, keeping my eyes fixed on Darnell. I'm calling to set up a payment arrangement for my daughter-in-law, Tiffany Moore. Tiffany Moore. She's a patient of Dr. Evans, 8 weeks pregnant. There was a pause, followed by the sound of typing over the line. One moment, Mr. Moore. Let me check our records. Darnell was sweating now, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Mr. Moore, the receptionist returned. I have a file for a Tiffany Moore, but she hasn't been seen here in 2 years. Her last visit was for a flu shot. We have no record of a pregnancy or any recent appointments. I stared at Darnell as the ultrasound photo slipped from my fingers and drifted to the floor. Are you sure? I asked, my voice hollow. My son is holding an ultrasound image right now. Darnell lunged forward, snatching the phone from my hand and ending the call. It was a different clinic, he shouted, his voice high-pitched. I got them mixed up. It wasn't Evans. It was someone else. I looked down at the paper on the floor, bent over, and picked it up. I looked at the patient ID number in the corner. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I looked at the date, today's date, but the timestamp read around 4 p.m. It was currently 11 a.m. I walked over to the computer and typed 8-week ultrasound image into the search bar. The very first result was the exact picture Darnell had handed me, down to the last pixel. It was a stock image from a medical website. I turned around. The sadness I felt was so deep, it felt like drowning. It was no longer anger, it was grief. I was grieving the son I thought I had, and I was grieving the grandchild who didn't exist. You lied, I whispered. You lied about a baby. You lied about a life. Darnell didn't apologize, nor did he cry. His face twisted into an ugly mask of entitlement. So what? He spat. You have millions, Dad. You sit on millions in that safe while living like a hermit. You owe me. If I have to lie to get what's mine, then I will. He wasn't a desperate father. He was a con artist, and I was his mark. I pointed toward the door. Get out. Darnell let out a harsh, bitter laugh. You'll regret this, old man. You're going to die alone in this dump, and nobody will care. I walked toward him, carrying no weapon, no hose, just the crushing weight of my disappointment. Get out, I repeated. before I call the police and report you for attempted fraud." Darnell threw me one last glare before turning and slamming the door behind him so hard the windows rattled. I stood in the quiet hallway, looking at the fake ultrasound photo in my hand. I crumpled it into a tight ball and threw it into the trash. The moment of weakness was over, and the final thread connecting us had been severed. I returned to the kitchen where Silas was waiting, having poured himself another drink. "I heard everything," Silas said quietly. I sat down, my hands steady once more, my heart turned to stone. "Silas," I said, "get the car. We have a land deal to intercept. Darnell thinks he's playing a game. I'm going to show him how the board is actually set." Silas drove the sedan with steady hands, the hands of a man who had spent half his life tracking down wrongdoers. We parked across the street from a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The kind of place where deals were often struck in low whispers over stale coffee and greasy eggs. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched my son, Darnell, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. He looked nervous, checking his watch every 30 seconds. Standing next to him was Brent, Tiffany's father. Brent looked different today. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sweaty, frantic energy. He was smoking, holding the cigarette with trembling fingers. They were waiting for a miracle, waiting for someone to buy a piece of land they didn't even own. Inside the car, Silas handed me an earpiece. Thanks to a listening device Silas had slipped into Darnell's jacket pocket during the chaos of the eviction, the audio was crystal clear. I heard Brent's sharp, demanding voice. "Stop pacing, Darnell. You look guilty. This guy buys properties with cash and doesn't ask questions. We take the money, pay off our immediate debts, and give ourselves breathing room to figure out our next move against your father." Darnell's voice came back in a fearful whisper. "But Brent, this is a serious crime, forging his signature on a property transfer deed. If he finds out, he won't find out," Brent snapped. "He's an old man distracted by his own spite. Besides, you're his only heir. Technically, it's your land anyway. We're just accelerating the timeline. We need this cash, Darnell. Tiffany needs this. Do you want your wife sleeping in a shelter?" I closed my eyes. The thief's defense, always a noble cause, always someone else's fault. Months ago, during a visit, they had raided my home office and taken the deed to a 5-acre commercial lot on the north side. It was a prime piece of property planned for a new shopping center, with a market value close to $500,000. Darnell knew this. He knew it was meant to be his future inheritance, but desperation makes people foolish. A black SUV pulled into the diner parking lot, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a trench coat and sunglasses despite the overcast weather. He wasn't a random investor. He was Mr. Stone, my head of corporate acquisitions. A man I trusted with my life, who was playing the role of a predatory buyer today. I watched Darnell and Brent straighten up and put on masks of confidence, leading Mr. Stone to a booth by the window. I could see them clearly through the glass. Darnell spoke quickly, gesturing with his hands, while Brent nodded along, trying to look like a seasoned partner. Silas turned up the volume. "So, Mr. Stone," Darnell said, his voice rising with tension. "As you can see, the title is clean. 5 acres, prime zoning. We're looking for a quick transaction, and we're willing to be reasonable. We were thinking $200,000. Mr. Stone didn't even look at the documents, merely gesturing to the waitress for coffee. $200,000? He said, his voice flat. "That's a fantasy. I did a title search. The registered owner is Thaddeus Moore. You are Darnell Moore, Darnell swallowed hard. Thaddeus is my father. He's incapacitated, and I have power of attorney. He wants to liquidate assets to cover his care costs. Incapacitated. Another lie, another nail in the coffin. Mr. Stone took a sip of coffee, looking at Darnell with cold indifference. Power of attorney is complicated, and probate is a mess. I don't like complications. I like clean, fast, and cheap. If I buy this land, I'm taking on risk. Your father could wake up tomorrow and sue me. He won't, Brent chimed in. He's very ill, Mr. Stone leaned forward. $50,000 cash today. Darnell gasped. 50,000. The land is worth $500,000. Mr. Stone shrugged. Then list it with a broker. Wait 6 months, pay commissions, and pay taxes. Or sign the paper right now and walk out with a bag of cash. Take it or leave it. I saw Darnell look at Brent, catching the silent exchange between them. They were drowning. They didn't have 6 months or even 6 days. They needed money right now to maintain the illusion of their life. 50 is too low. Darnell made one last attempt. Can you do 75? 50, Mr. Stone repeated. And you sign the deed right now with Thaddeus Moore's signature. Not as an authorized representative, but the owner's signature. I don't care whose hand holds the pen. This was the trap within the trap. If Darnell signed as a representative, it was fraud. But if he forged my signature, it constituted forgery, identity theft, and real estate fraud. A prison sentence written on a piece of paper. Sign it, Brent hissed. 50,000 is enough to rent an apartment and pay off the credit cards. Sign it. Darnell picked up the pen. I held my breath. A part of me, the father who had taught him to ride a bike, wanted to break through the glass, run inside, and knock the pen out of his hand. I wanted to save him from crossing that line from ungrateful son to a felon. But I stayed in the car. Darnell had made his choice, choosing the in-laws who encouraged his worst instincts over the father who had expected his best. I watched his hand move across the paper. Without hesitation, he forged the name Thaddeus Moore, with the smooth stroke of someone who had studied my signature on checks for 30 years. He pushed the paper across the table, and Mr. Stone inspected the signature, nodded, and reached under the table to produce a thick manila envelope, placing it on the table. Count it if you want, Stone said. Darnell grabbed the envelope, opening it just enough to see the stacks of $100 bills. The look of greed in his eyes was painful to witness. He didn't count it. He simply stuffed it into his jacket. Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Stone said, standing up. Darnell and Brent practically ran out of the diner, riding high on the adrenaline of their crime. They high-fived in the parking lot and laughed, thinking they had just pulled off the heist of the century, believing they had outsmarted the old man. I got it! Darnell shouted, climbing into the passenger seat of Brent's rented car. $50,000. We're back in the game. They sped away, tires screeching, leaving the evidence of their destruction behind. Mr. Stone stepped out of the diner, crossed the street, and leaned down near my car window. He handed the deed to me. The ink wasn't even dry, and the signature was a precise forgery. He took the bait, Stone said calmly. We have him on video inside the diner. The notary is my cousin's, so she witnessed the forgery and notarized it, knowing it was a sting. You've got him, Thaddeus. He just sold your land for 10 cents on the dollar and committed a Class B felony to do it. I took the paper. It felt heavy, no longer just a deed, but an arrest warrant waiting to be filed. What about the cash? I asked. Counterfeit, Stone replied. High-quality prop money. enough to fool a desperate man in a dimly lit diner. But the moment he tries to deposit or spend it, he's in deep trouble. I nodded. Keep the paperwork, Stone. We won't use it just yet. Let him feel rich for a few hours. Let him spend it in his mind. When he realizes he sold his soul for monopoly money, the fall will hurt much worse. Silas started the engine. Where to, boss? He asked. I took one last look at the forged signature. It looked like my name, but it felt like a goodbye letter. To the courthouse, I said. They're filing for guardianship tomorrow, and I'm going to be ready. They think I'm the prey. Now it's time to show them I'm the hunter. Darnell thought he had just bought his freedom, unaware he had actually signed his own confession. The trap was set, Silas. Now we just had to watch him step right into it. The summons arrived at my door like a thief in the night, handed over by a server who couldn't even look me in the eye. I opened the thick stack of papers at the kitchen table. Petition for emergency guardianship stared back at me in bold, accusatory letters. Beneath it was a narrative twisting my life into a horror story of cognitive decline and extreme danger. Darnell claimed I had late-stage dementia, Cisse, using the Christmas Day eviction as proof of a mental breakdown. He claimed I was hoarding assets and living in neglect despite having the means to do better. A sign of severe cognitive loss, according to the petition. The core of his argument was a flash drive taped inside the cover. I plugged it into my computer, and a video file opened up. A digital Frankenstein monster stitched together from clips of my life. There was a clip of me smashing an old toilet with a sledgehammer in the backyard, filmed by Darnell 2 years ago during a bathroom renovation, but edited to look like a fit of senseless rage. Another audio track caught me yelling at the TV during a football game, overlaid onto footage of me in an empty room. It was a masterclass in manipulation, engineered to make a 70-year-old man look like a violent, confused threat. I watched it twice without a single tremor in my hands or a spike in my pulse, feeling only a cold, sharp clarity. This was their nuclear option. They couldn't ask for the money, and they couldn't steal it. So now they wanted to erase me. They wanted to turn Thaddeus Moore from a man into a ward of the state. 2 hours later, a heavy knock rattled the door, bringing the full weight of legal authority. I opened it to find 2 uniformed officers and a woman with a clipboard in an EMT uniform. Mr. Thaddeus Moore? The lead officer asked, his hand resting near his belt in a clear warning. I'm Thaddeus, I said, stepping back to show I was calm and unarmed. Sir, we have a court order for an emergency psychiatric evaluation, the officer said, handing me a paper. Your family filed a petition stating you pose an immediate danger to yourself and others. We need you to come with us to St. Jude's Behavioral Health Center. I looked past them down the street. Darnell's rented car was parked half a block away, and I caught a glimpse of his pale, anxious face watching through the windshield. He wasn't gloating. He looked terrified because he knew there was no turning back. If this failed, he was completely finished. I didn't argue, shout, or resist, knowing that was exactly what they wanted. The angry old man from the video. I understand, officer, I said steadily. Let me grab my jacket. It's cold out. The officer looked surprised, expecting a fight, screaming, or tears. Instead, I walked to the closet, put on my coat, locked the door behind me, and walked out. As they led me to the ambulance, I saw Darnell duck lower in his seat. He expected a spectacle and chaos, but instead he got dignity. The one thing a liar can't fight. St. Jude's was a sterile facility smelling of bleach and desperation. They took my belt, shoelaces, and phone, locking me in a room with white walls and a heavy steel door. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited, knowing this game required patience. An hour later, Dr. Vance walked in, a short man with nervous eyes, holding a clipboard like a shield. He didn't look like a physician trying to heal people. He looked like a man with gambling debts. I knew the type, and I knew Darnell hadn't picked him by accident. "Mr. Moore," Dr. Vance said, sitting across from me, "I'm here to evaluate your cognitive state. Your son is very concerned about you, stating you've shown aggressive behavior and paranoia." I stared straight at him without blinking. "My son is a thief, doctor," I said calmly. "He forged my signature yesterday on a land deed, and he owes a loan shark $100,000. He isn't worried about my brain. He's worried about my wallet." Dr. Vance scribbled something on his pad. "Paranoid delusions regarding family finances," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. I leaned forward. "If I have the receipts—" "Doctor, it's not a delusion." Vance stopped writing and looked up, his eyes darting toward the door before returning to me. "Mr. Moore, we have video evidence of you destroying property. We have testimony from your daughter-in-law that you threatened them with a weapon. A garden hose. Only after they refused to leave my home," I corrected. "That's trespassing, doctor, not dementia." Vance stood up and walked to the window, avoiding my eyes. "Look, Thaddeus. Can I call you Thaddeus? Cooperation is key. If you agree to a temporary guardianship, we can make this very comfortable. A nice facility, good food. Your son just wants to take the heavy lifting off your shoulders." I offered a cold, humorless smile. "How much is he paying you, doctor? Or did he just promise to pay you once he gets access to my accounts?" Vance's face turned bright red. "That is an accusation, Mr. Moore, and a symptom of your condition." "It's a question," I said. "And here's another one. Do you know the penalty for medical fraud or faking a diagnosis to assist in elder abuse? Because my attorney, Reginald Moss, is currently filing a subpoena for your bank records." Vance dropped his pen, its click echoing off the linoleum floor. "Reginald Moss," he whispered. "The apex predator," I said. "He's on his way, and he's bringing the FBI. You have about 10 minutes to decide if you want to be a witness or a defendant." Vance looked at me, seeing the absolute calm and intelligence in my eyes. He realized he had been dragged into a trap by a desperate man's lies. He picked up his pen with trembling hands. I need to check your vital signs," Vance stammered, backing toward the door. "I'll be right back." He ran out of the room. I leaned back on the bed and closed my eyes. I wasn't trapped. I was right where I needed to be. The net had closed, but Darnell didn't realize his own leg was caught in the gears. I waited for Reggie's voice to echo down the hallway, knowing it wouldn't take long. The first night in psychiatric observation was a test of endurance designed to break the strongest person. The room was freezing, filled with the low hum of fluorescent lights, and without my watch I could only measure time by the shift changes. At 9 o'clock sharp, the heavy steel door opened, and a large nurse named Brenda stepped in with a small paper cup and a bottle of water. "Mr. Moore," she said in a flat tone. "Meds time. Dr. Vance prescribed a sedative to help with your agitation." I sat up on the edge of the cot. "I'm waiting for my lawyer, and I don't need medication." Brenda didn't blink, stepping closer into my personal space. "This isn't a request. Either you take the pill or we give you a shot. It's the protocol for mandatory hold, and if you fight us, we restrain you." Do you want to be restrained, Mr. Moore? I looked at the cup containing 2 blue thorazine pills. A chemical lobotomy meant to turn a lion into a lamb and a clear thinker into a placid shell. If I took them, I would lose my sharp mind and the war, but if I fought her, she would call guards to force a needle into my vein. I had to be smarter, a fox instead of a bear. All right, I said, forcing my shoulders to slump. I'll take them. I just want to sleep. She handed over the cup and water, watching me like a hawk. I threw the pills into my mouth, swallowed loudly with a big gulp of water, and opened my mouth, raising my tongue. Good, Brenda said, turning to mark her clipboard. In that fraction of a second, I feigned a small cough into my hand, concealing the movement as the 2 pills palmed from my cheek pocket slid down my side and under the mattress in one smooth gesture. It was a trick I learned 50 years ago from a buddy in the trenches. Brenda turned back. Sleep well, Mr. Moore. She left, locking the door with a heavy click. I waited 10 minutes until her footsteps faded down the hall, then retrieved the dissolving pills and flushed them down the toilet. My mind remained my own, as I lay back on the hard mattress to wait, knowing Darnell wouldn't be able to resist coming to see me broken. The opportunity came at 2 in the morning, when the wing was quiet, save for the distant groans of a restless patient. I heard the electronic beep of the keypad on my door, so I closed my eyes, keeping my breathing slow and heavy to appear deeply sedated. The door opened with the click of dress shoes and squeaking rubber soles. He's completely under, Dr. Vance whispered. We gave him a double dose. He won't wake up for 12 hours. Good, came Darnell's voice, shaking yet full of greed. Can we keep him like this? Vance sighed. We can keep him sedated during the 72-hour observation, but after that, we need a judge to sign off on long-term commitment, which requires a hearing. I don't want a hearing, Darnell hissed. My dad is clever, and if he stands before a judge lucid, he'll talk his way out. I need him incapacitated. Vance, I need you to write that he has advanced dementia and violent tendencies. That's too risky, Darnell, Vance said, his voice dropping lower. That's fraud. If the board finds out, I lose my license and go to prison. You won't go to prison, Darnell argued, because you'll be rich. Once I get power of attorney, I can access TNB Holdings accounts. There are millions there, Vance. The day the papers are signed, I'll wire you $20,000 in cash. I lay there, my body rigid with anger as my own son bargained away my sanity for the price of a used car, standing over his father's bed to negotiate a chemical lobotomy just to settle his debts. 20 is too low, Vance countered. This is high risk. 30,000. Fine, 30,000, Darnell agreed instantly. Just keep him under, block his calls, keep his lawyer away, and fog his mind until he signs. Deal, Vance said. They shook hands, and I heard the rustle of clothes as they turned to leave, believing they were safe in a dim room with a drugged old man. They had no idea that taped beneath the metal bed frame, inches from their knees, was a tiny voice-activated digital recorder. I had transferred it from my jacket lining to under the bed the moment I arrived, and its battery had 10 hours of life. It caught every word, every bargain, and every piece of the conspiracy. Darnell walked over to the bed, his breath warm on my face. Goodbye, Dad, he whispered. You should have just given me the money. Now you lose everything. He walked out, and the door locked. I opened my eyes in the dark, knowing I hadn't lost everything. I had just won. I retrieved the recorder, checked the small red light flashing once, and confirmed the evidence was secure. Now, I just had to wait out the clock. The next day passed in a blur of feigned lethargy. I shuffled when prompted, stared blankly at the wall when breakfast arrived, and palmed 3 more doses of pills, playing the broken old man to perfection. At precisely the 48th hour, the door was slammed open with immense force against the concrete wall. Dr. Vance stood there, pale as a sheet, backed by a wall of black suits. Reginald Moss stepped into the room, wearing a pinstripe suit looking like an avenging angel, flanked by 4 federal agents in windbreakers marked FBI. "Get away from my client!" Reggie roared at Vance. "Mr. Moss!" Vance stammered, backing away. We were evaluating. You are holding a United States citizen against his will, based on falsified medical evidence," Reggie announced, his voice echoing through the ward. He held up a document with a gold seal. "This is a writ of habeas corpus signed an hour ago by a federal judge ordering the immediate release of Thaddeus Moore. And these," he pointed to the agents, "are the authorities." 2 agents stepped past Reggie and grabbed Dr. Vance, pinning him against the wall. "Dr. Alan Vance, you are under arrest for medical fraud, conspiracy to kidnap, and violations of the RICO Act," an agent read. Vance panicked, shouting, "Darnell made me do it. He paid me. I have the text messages." Reggie walked over to my side, his eyes furious as he looked at my hospital gown and bare feet. "Are you all right, Thaddeus?" he asked softly. I reached under the mattress, pulled out the micro recorder, and handed it to him. "I'm fine, Reggie," I said, my voice sharp and clear. "I got the confession. They bargained over the price of my mind for $30,000. Reggie took the recorder, a predatory smile breaking across his face. "Let's get you out of here. Thaddeus, there's a suit waiting for you in the car, and we have a date at court." I stood up, walked out of the room, and strode down the hallway past terrified nurses and confused patients. I stepped through the double doors and out into the sunlight, where the air tasted sweet. Darnell tried to bury me in a pit of madness, but he had only dug his own grave, and I was holding the shovel. I sat in the executive suite of TNB holding on the 30th floor. A place Darnell had never seen because he believed his father didn't belong in a high-rise view. Below lay the grid of steel and ambition that I helped build. On my desk sat a stack of contracts, the lifelines for visionary strategies. The boutique marketing firm where Darnell served as senior vice president. He believed he held the position through charisma and business acumen, boasting about his 6-figure advance and corner office. Unaware that Visionary Strategies was a shell company I acquired 5 years ago to give him a playground. I was his only client and his sole source of revenue. Every dollar he thought he earned was an allowance I funded to make him feel important. I picked up my pen, heavy and cold, and looked at the termination order in front of me. It was a simple document stating that TNB Holding was exercising its right to cancel all service agreements with Visionary Strategies due to conflicts of interest and reputational risk, naming Darnell Moore as the cause. I signed my name in indelible black ink and handed the document to my assistant. "File it," I said, "and notify the building manager to initiate lockdown procedures for their suite." I turned to my monitor, accessing the internal servers of Visionary Strategies to watch the digital fallout in real time. At 9 o'clock sharp, the cancellation email hit the inbox of Mr. Sterling, the agency's CEO, whom I paid to babysit my son. At 9:05 a.m., the agency's bank accounts tied to my treasury were frozen, stopping the flow of funds instantly, like cutting a diver's airline. Darnell sat in his office, likely shopping online for watches he could no longer afford, oblivious that the air in the room was gone. I felt a cold satisfaction. He had told me I was no longer family, so I simply granted his wish and cut off the 10-year allowance he relied on. Across town, the collapse was swift and brutal. I watched the live feed from the lobby security camera at Visionary Strategies as Mr. Sterling rushed out of his office, pale-faced, straight toward Darnell's glass sanctuary. N, 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 my su- I couldn't hear their words, but the body language was intense as Sterling slammed the termination notice onto Darnell's desk. Darnell stood up, knocking over his expensive chair, waving his hands and shouting as he tried to explain. But no explanation works when you are the toxin poisoning the company. Sterling pointed to the door, giving Darnell no time to pack boxes or say goodbye to the secretary he treated like a servant. Security guards appeared on either side of Darnell, escorting him through the open workspace, while employees watched in silence. They knew Darnell was a fraud riding on their hard work, and now they watched him get thrown out. Darnell looked terrified, checking his phone to call me, but his calls were blocked. He was marched into the elevator and pushed inside. In the lobby, the building manager slapped a bright orange notice onto the glass doors. Impounded for non-payment, while the locksmith I sent an hour ago changed the locks. Darnell stumbled onto the sidewalk into a cold gray drizzle that soaked his suit. He stood there, looking up at the building he thought he ruled. He had no job, no office, and no income. Reaching into his pocket, he realized he had left his car keys on his desk, rendering him unable to return, and even if he could, he had no car left to drive. He was just a man standing on the sidewalk, with nothing but the wet clothes on his back. The dominoes falling precisely as I had arranged them. In a cheap motel room on the edge of town, Tiffany sat on a lumpy mattress staring at her phone screen. She saw the news alert on a local business blog. Local marketing collapses after loss of key investor, with Darnell's name cited as the cause. Tiffany felt the walls closing in, the stale smell of cigarettes and mildew filling her nose. This wasn't the life she was promised. She had married Darnell for penthouse views and black credit cards, not a cheap motel and eviction notices. She looked at her wedding ring, the diamond I paid for, spinning it on her finger and realizing it might be her only remaining asset. In that moment, she made a decision driven not by love or loyalty, but by the survival instinct of a rat abandoning a sinking ship. If Darnell was broke, he was useless to her. She unlocked her phone, opened a hidden contacts folder, scrolled past Darnell and her parents, and paused at a name she hadn't dialed in years. Chad. Chad was her college boyfriend, dumped for not being ambitious enough. But rumors suggested he had recently inherited a fortune. Those rumors had been carefully planted over the past week through mutual acquaintances by me. Chad wasn't an heir. He was an actor I hired from a local theater troupe, set up in a luxury suite at the Ritz-Carlton with a wardrobe of Italian suits. He was the bait, shiny and expensive, designed for a gold digger. Tiffany typed out a message. "Hey stranger. Long time no see. Heard you were in town. Would love to catch up." I sat in my apartment sipping tea, watching the message pop up on the cloned phone I gave the actor. She didn't wait for Darnell to come home and explain or seek comfort. The moment she saw the ship sinking, she looked for a lifeboat. I picked up my secondary phone and texted the actor. She took the bait. Reel her in. Invite her to the charity gala tonight. Tell her you need a date. Tiffany replied 30 seconds after receiving the invite. I'd love to. Darnell and I are having issues, and it would be wonderful to be around someone with class again. I let out a dry, humorless laugh as she walked straight into the lion's den. Darnell was losing his career, while his wife was putting on makeup to meet another man. They were truly made for each other, but tonight, both would get exactly what they deserved in front of the entire city. The stage for the final act was set. The Metropolitan Charity Gala was the biggest event of this season, held in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel, under crystal chandeliers that smelled of old money. Tickets were $5,000 a plate, and though my name wasn't on the program, I was a diamond sponsor. I sat at a corner table, in the shadows, invisible to the elites, drinking sparkling water and watching the main entrance. At 8:30 p.m., Darnell and Tiffany arrived without tickets or invitations, but desperation made them bold. They slipped through the service entrance, blending in with a group of late-arriving musicians. Darnell wore an ill-fitting tuxedo, likely rented or borrowed, while Tiffany wore a dress far too flashy for the occasion, a desperate attempt to be noticed. They weren't there for charity. They were hunting. Darnell needed a new investor to save his collapsing career, while Tiffany scanned the crowd for Chad, the wealthy ex-boyfriend I had dangled in front of her. They moved through the crowd like sharks in a goldfish bowl, eyes darting, smiles tight and predatory. I watched Darnell corner a venture capitalist near the bar, speaking rapidly with flailing hands, while the man backed away uncomfortably. Tiffany texted frantically, looking for her golden parachute. They looked pathetic, fakes in a world they didn't belong to. The lights dimmed, the crowd quieted, and the host took the stage to welcome everyone. This was Darnell's moment. I saw him push past a waiter and adjust his tie, unwilling to wait for an introduction as he seized the spotlight. He strode up the steps to the stage, snatched the microphone from the stunned host, and tapped it twice. Harsh feedback cut through the speakers, making everyone wince. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Darnell announced, his voice loud and slightly slurred. "I am Darnell Moore. Many of you know me as a successful marketing executive, but tonight I stand before you as a victim of a cruel, vindictive father who stripped away my livelihood and home out of jealousy over my success." A wave of confused whispers rippled through the room as people pointed and asked, "Who is this? Is this part of the show?" Darnell pushed on, growing bolder. "My father, Thaddeus Moore, is a tyrant who hated that I married a woman of class and had ambition. He cut off my funds, left me with nothing, and tried to ruin my reputation. But I'm here to ask for your help, seeking partners who believe in innovation and family values unlike my father." He paused for effect, waiting for applause or sympathy, but received only a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Then, behind him, the giant projection screen, meant to display images of needy children, flickered to life. It wasn't a charity video, but raw footage from a hotel room camera, the Ritz-Carlton suite I had rented for Chad. The video showed Tiffany, Darnell's wife, sitting on the edge of the bed with a glass of wine, laughing with a man who was not her husband. "I'm so glad I called you, Chad." Tiffany's voice echoed through the ballroom speakers, clear as a bell. "Darnell is a loser who is completely broke and tricked me into marrying him. I need a real man with actual money. Someone like you." The ballroom erupted in gasps and shocked laughter. Darnell spun around, staring at the screen in horror as he watched the wife he had just defended betray him in high definition. The video cut to black, replaced by an audio recording from the listening device I had slipped into Darnell's pocket weeks ago. "I can't stand her parents." Darnell's voice sneered, loud and ugly. "Brent and Susan are parasites, trash wrapped in expensive clothes. Once I get my dad's money, I'm kicking them to the curb, because they reek of desperate poverty." The audio cut out, and the house lights came up. Darnell froze on stage, the microphone hanging loosely in his hand as he looked out at the audience. He saw Tiffany standing by the bar, her face pale with terror. He saw Brent and Susan, who had somehow managed to sneak in, staring up at him with hatred. "You ungrateful little rat," Brent yelled, charging toward the stage. He was no fighter, but sheer rage gave him speed. He tackled Darnell, knocking him off the podium. They tumbled onto the floor in a mess of limbs and rented tuxedos. Throwing punches and swearing at each other, Tiffany screamed and tried to run, but tripped over her own dress, tumbling down right beside them. The guests, the absolute elite of the city, pulled out their phones to record every second. It was absolute chaos, a total collapse, and it was glorious to watch. I stood up from my table at the back and straightened my jacket. I didn't need to say a single word because the truth had already spoken for me. I walked toward the exit just as security personnel rushed the stage to break up the fight. Darnell was ruined, Tiffany was exposed, and the Millers were tearing each other apart. I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the noise of their destruction behind. Plan Z was complete, and now it was just a matter of cleaning up the debris. 3 days after the charity event, the city was covered under a layer of freezing rain. The streets were deserted, and the wind howled through the narrow alleys of the south side. I sat in the dark of my living room, the only light coming from the street lamps filtering through the blinds. I wasn't sleeping. I was waiting. I knew my son. I knew that when a man was stripped of his pride, his money, and his reputation, he wouldn't reflect on his own sins. He would lash out, looking for a quick fix. And Darnell knew exactly where my ledger was kept. He remembered the steel safe, hidden behind the painting of the lighthouse. He believed that safe was packed with bundles of cash. Millions I had kept from him. He failed to realize that the true value lay in the paper trail, not the cash itself. At 2 a.m, a shadow moved past the front window. A heavy, stumbling shadow. Darnell was drunk. I could hear him muttering to himself outside, cursing the cold, the ice, and me. He held a bottle of cheap whiskey in one hand and something glinted in the other, beneath the street lamp, a long, serrated kitchen knife. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to take. He was completely out of options. His friends had abandoned him. His wife was at war with him, and his in-laws had been exposed as frauds. He had nowhere left to go except back to the father he despised. Not to beg for forgiveness, but to demand what he believed was his birthright. I heard the sound of metal scraping against the door lock. He tried to pick it, but his hands were shaking too violently. Frustration took over, and he kicked the door once, twice, 3 times. The solid wood didn't budge. I had reinforced the frame days ago, anticipating this exact moment. He let out a raw, animalistic shout of frustration, followed by the sharp crack of shattering glass. Using the handle of the knife, he smashed a small pane near the latch, reached inside, and unlocked the deadbolt. The door swung open, slamming hard against the wall. Darnell stumbled into the hallway, bringing the storm inside with him, reeking of sweat and cheap alcohol. He didn't call out my name or check to see if I was awake. He moved with a single, destructive purpose. stepping heavily into the living room and kicking over the small table where I kept my reading glasses. The lamp crashed to the floor, the bulb shattering with a sharp pop. "Where is it?" he slurred, waving the knife wildly through the air. "Where's the money, old man? I know you have it. You have millions. You owe me." He walked over to the wall and ripped the painting of the lighthouse right off its mount. The canvas tore, and the frame cracked as he tossed it aside, without a second thought for the fact that it was a gift his mother had painted 20 years ago. He saw the safe, his eyes lighting up with greed. Dropping the whiskey bottle, it shattered on the floor, soaking the rug. He grabbed the dial of the safe with both hands, spinning it frantically back and forth, as if brute force alone could break the mechanism. "Open up!" he screamed, pounding his fist against the steel door. "Open, you piece of junk!" When the safe didn't yield, he turned his rage on the rest of the room. He slashed the sofa cushions with the knife, tearing the fabric and sending stuffing floating through the air like snow. He swept every book off my shelves and shattered a vase that had been passed down through generations. He was destroying the only real home he had ever known, all to find a fortune he would have squandered in a week. It was heartbreaking, pathetic, and final proof that the son I loved was gone, consumed by his own monster of entitlement. He turned toward the hallway, breathing heavily, holding the knife low at his side. "I'm going to wake him up," he muttered. "I'll put this knife right to his throat and make him open it. He's going to give me everything." He took a step toward my bedroom. A sharp click echoed through the sudden silence, the heavy sound of an industrial light switch being flipped. The overhead floodlights I had installed in the corners of the room flashed on, blindingly bright. Darnell threw a hand up to shield his eyes, dropping the knife in surprise. It landed on the hardwood floor with a loud clatter. "Hello, son," I said. I was sitting in the armchair in the corner of the room, having not moved an inch. I was wearing my best suit, my hands resting calmly on the armrests. But I wasn't alone. Sitting beside me on a folding chair was a man in full uniform. Police Chief Marcus Holloway. Marcus and I had known each other for 40 years, often playing chess on Tuesdays. He was quietly sipping a cup of tea. Darnell blinked, trying to focus as his eyes adjusted to the glare. He saw me, he saw the chief, and he saw the knife lying on the floor between us. He looked down at his hands, still raised in a defensive stance, and then looked at the destruction around him. The shredded sofa, the broken lamp, the shattered vase. "Dad," Darnell whispered, his voice trembling. I lost my keys. I was just looking for—" "Stop," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying quiet authority. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He stood up slowly and placed his teacup on the side table. "Darnell Moore, you are currently standing in a private residence you forced your way into. There is a weapon on the floor, extensive property damage, and you are intoxicated." Darnell looked at Marcus, then turned to me. "Dad, tell him. Tell him I live here. Tell him this is all a misunderstanding." I looked at my son, the boy who used to run into my arms with a scraped knee, and the man who had just threatened to cut my throat for money. "You don't live here, Darnell," I said, my voice completely flat. "You were evicted. You received legal notice. You are trespassing. You are armed, and you just attempted to rob me." "No," Darnell cried, dropping to his knees. "I didn't want to hurt you. I just needed the money." "The loan sharks, Dad. They're going to kill me. I needed the cash in the safe." "There is no cash in the safe," I said. "Only paper, the proof of everything I gave you, and everything you threw away." Marcus stepped over to Darnell, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal clicked as he locked Darnell's wrists behind his back. Darnell Moore, you are under arrest for breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, and attempted robbery. Marcus read off. You have the right to remain silent. Darnell began to sob, a messy sound mixed with fear and self-pity. Dad, please don't let them take me. I'm your son. I stood up, walked over to him, and looked down at the mess he had made of my life and his own. I was waiting for you, Darnell, I said quietly. I sat here in the dark praying you wouldn't come. I prayed you would go to a shelter, call a friend, or sleep in your car. You would hit rock bottom and start climbing back up. But you didn't. You came here to take, and you came here to hurt. You made your choice. I nodded to Marcus. Take him. Marcus hauled Darnell to his feet, leading him toward the door past the broken glass and the ruined painting. Darnell turned to look back at me one last time, his eyes full of terror. Dad! He screamed as Marcus pushed him out into the rain. Dad, help me! I watched the door close and heard the sirens of the waiting patrol car fade into the distance. Once again, I was alone in my bright, ruined apartment. I walked over to the painting of the lighthouse, picked it up, and tried to smooth out the torn canvas. My hands were shaking now. Noah. Not from fear, but from the heavy grief of doing what had to be done. I had caught the thief and stopped the threat, but the taste of victory was like ashes in my mouth. The county detention center was a concrete box designed to strip away a person's humanity, and it was working on my son. The air inside smelled of stale dealie meat and industrial back of your throat that stuck to the back of your throat. I sat in a small interrogation room, the metal table bolted to the floor, feeling cold beneath my fingertips. I wasn't there as a visitor. I was there as the victim of a crime. Chief Marcus had arranged 10 minutes of private time before Darnell was transferred to the general population. I wore my Sunday suit, the same one I wore when he threw me out on Christmas Day, so he could see exactly who he had cast aside. The heavy steel door opened with a buzz and a heavy thud. A guard walked in, leading a man in a bright orange jumpsuit. His wrists were cuffed to his waist, and his ankles were chained together, forcing him to take small, humiliating, shuffling steps. It took me a moment to recognize him. The Darnell who stood on his porch, swirling scotch and looking down his nose at me, was gone. In his place was a terrified boy with hollow eyes and pale skin. He hadn't showered, his hair was matted, and he smelled of fear and neglect. The guard pushed him into the chair across from me, locked the door, and left us in the humming silence of the room. Darnell didn't look at me, staring instead at his hands on the metal table, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve, shivering. The chains rattled softly, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. "Hello, Darnell," I said softly, the words filling the small space between us. He raised his head, his eyes red and swollen. Seeing me, he showed no anger or defiance. He simply broke down completely. His shoulders slumped, and his face twisted into a mask of pure misery. "Dad," he choked out. "Dad, you have to get me out of here. This is a nightmare. There are monsters in here, Dad. I haven't slept. I haven't eaten. Please, I'll do anything. Just pay the bail. I know you have the money." I leaned back in my chair and watched him, remembering when he was a toddler crying over a dropped ice cream cone. Back then, I bought him another one and solved the problem. But I couldn't solve this. I couldn't buy another ice cream to replace the integrity he had thrown away. "I'm not here to post your bail, Darnell. I said. Robbery is a felony. Assault with a deadly weapon is a felony. And a man caught holding a knife in his father's living room doesn't get bail. Darnell began to weep openly, a wet, desperate sound. He slid out of his chair, the chains pulling tight, but managed to get down on his knees on the dirty linoleum floor, pressing his forehead against the edge of the table near my hands. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't mean it. I was drunk and terrified. I didn't want to hurt you. I swear I just needed help." "Get up," I commanded. He didn't move, groveling on the floor. "It wasn't my fault," he whispered against the metal table. "It was them. It was Tiffany. She drove me crazy, Dad, spending so much money. Every day it was something new. A bag, a trip, a dinner. She said she'd leave me if I couldn't provide, that I wasn't a real man if I couldn't give her the world. I just wanted to make her happy." I listened to him blame the woman he had sworn to protect. A minute ago he was a predator, and now he was playing the victim. "And Brent," he continued, the words tumbling out desperately. "Her father is evil. He told me you were holding out on me, that I deserved that money. He put those ideas in my head, Dad, saying we should sell the land and that you wouldn't notice. I didn't want to do it. I told him it was wrong, but he pressured me, saying we needed the cash for the catering bill and that you owed us." A wave of nausea washed over me, tasting like bitter bile. Even in chains, he couldn't take responsibility, willing to throw his wife and father-in-law into the fire just to see if it would burn down the prison walls. He was a coward, a weak, spineless man who would betray anyone to save himself. "So you're saying you're innocent?" I asked flatly. "You're saying Tiffany and Brent forced you to break into my house with a knife?" "Yes." Darnell looked up at me, eyes filled with desperate hope. "Yes, Dad. They manipulated me. I'm the victim here. Please, tell the police. Tell them I'm a good son and let me come home." I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out a folded document instead of a checkbook. I unfolded it and smoothed it flat on the table, a plea deal drafted by Reggie and approved by the district attorney an hour ago. "Get up, Darnell," I said again. He scrambled back into his chair, wiping his nose on his shoulder, staring at the paper. "What's this?" he asked. "This is your lifeline," I said. "This is the only help you're getting from me." I pointed to the paragraphs. "I have the deed, Darnell. The deed to the 5-acre commercial lot you signed away at the diner for $50,000 in counterfeit bills." Darnell turned pale. "You know about that?" "I know everything," I said. "I have video of you forging my signature. That's a forgery, fraud, and grand theft, which carries 10 years on its own. Combined with breaking and entering and assault, you're looking at 20 years in state prison. By the time you get out, you'll be an old man. Darnell, older than I am right now." He began to hyperventilate. No, Dad, please." I tapped the paper. "Here's the deal. You plead guilty to forgery and accept a 2-year sentence in a minimum security facility. In exchange, I will drop the breaking and entering and assault charges, telling the district attorney it was a family dispute and that I don't want to press charges for the knife." 2 years? Darnell whispered. 2 years is a long time. "It's a gift," I snapped. "It's mercy you don't deserve. But there's one condition." I pushed a pen toward him. "You testify against Brent Miller. You tell the police exactly how he helped you plan the sale and encouraged you to forge my signature. You give them dates, times, and conversations, delivering him to them on a silver platter." Darnell looked at the pen, then at me, and then at the door leading to the cells, realizing he had no options left. He could protect the father-in-law, who called him a rat, or he could save 18 years of his life. He didn't hesitate, grabbing the pen with a trembling hand, driven purely by self-preservation. "I'll do it," he said, his voice thick with relief and malice. "I'll tell them everything. Brent can rot in prison. He forced me to do it. It was all his idea." He signed his name, the scratch of the pen sounding like a rat gnawing through a rope, before pushing the paper back to me. "Did I do good, Dad?" he asked, seeking approval. "Is that to fix it?" I picked up the paper and put it back in my pocket, standing up to look down at him one last time. "You did what you've always done, Darnell," I said. "You took the easy way out." I knocked on the door, and the guard opened it instantly. "We're done," I said. "Dad, wait!" Darnell shouted as I walked away. "Will you visit me? Will you put money on my commissary?" I didn't look back, and the heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off his voice. I walked down the long gray hallway, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. I had the confession and the witness. Darnell was going to prison, but he was taking the Millers down with him. It was a tragedy, but it was also justice. And sometimes justice is the only love a father has left to give. I sat in the command center of TNB Holding, surrounded by the soft hum of servers and the cool blue glow of high-definition monitors. It was 3:00 a.m. on a Tuesday, and while most men my age were fast asleep, I was awake, watching the perimeter of my life like an eagle guarding its nest. I knew she would come. Darnell was in custody, Brent was facing charges, and the house of cards had collapsed, leaving one person in the wreckage with enough rage to burn the world down. Tiffany. She arrived in a battered sedan, likely rented or borrowed. I watched, through the infrared camera, as the car pulled up a block away from my duplex. She stepped into the darkness, no longer the polished social-to-socialite see champagne, but a safe phantom. Her blonde hair was matted, and she wore a dark hoodie pulled low over her face alongside stained sweatpants. In her right hand, she carried a heavy plastic gas can, the fumes thick even in the cold night air. She didn't look around for witnesses or hesitate, marching toward my house with a stiff stride, driven by pure, unfiltered madness. She had lost her husband, her status, and her future, and in her twisted mind, I was the architect of her misery, with fire being the only way to cleanse it. She crossed the street and stepped onto my lawn, pausing to look up at the dark second-story window where she assumed I was sleeping. I zoomed in on her face with the camera. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her lips moving as she muttered curses under her breath. Unscrewing the cap of the gas can, she began to pour the fuel, splashing the liquid across my porch steps and soaking the doormat and wood siding. She was reckless, splashing gasoline over her own shoes and pants in her rush to burn me alive and hear me scream. I didn't reach for the phone to call 911 just yet, reaching instead for the console on my desk. Tiffany thought she was attacking an old man's house, unaware she was targeting the fortress of a retired infrastructure engineer who had spent 30 years designing fire suppression systems for chemical plants and high-risk facilities. My home was a machine, and I had just armed it. I watched her pull a silver lighter from her pocket, the flame jumping to life, a small orange dancer in the dark. She raised her arm, preparing to toss it onto the gas-soaked porch. "Now," I whispered, pressing the activation button. The response was instantaneous. Not a standard trickling sprinkler, but a military-grade suppression system built for rapid fire control. A series of nozzles hidden under the porch eaves and in the flower beds burst to life, spraying not water, but a high-expansion chemical foam, a dense white substance used to smother jet fuel fires. The foam hit her with the force of a fire hose, expanding on contact with the air and filling the entire porch area within seconds. It knocked the lighter right out of her hand, instantly snuffing the flame, and slammed Tiffany to the ground. She screamed, the sound muffled by the expanding white mass. The foam was sticky and heavy, clinging to her clothes, hair, and skin, filling the space and rising waist-high in a matter of seconds. She tried to stand, but slipped in the chemical slush. She tried to run, but the foam pulled her down like quicksand, disorienting her as she flailed her arms like a swimmer drowning in a sea of white cotton. I activated the second phase of the defense, the floodlights. 6,000 lumens of LED lights illuminated the front yard, turning night into blinding day. Tiffany shielded her eyes, screaming in terror, completely exposed. A figure covered in white sludge, reeking of gasoline and failure, trapped in a cage of light and foam. Then the audio system engaged. I picked up the microphone, my voice amplified through the external speakers, booming across the neighborhood. "Tiffany Miller," I said, "drop the lighter and stay where you are. You are trespassing and attempting arson, and the police have already been notified." She froze, looking up at the speakers, frantically searching for an escape. But the foam made every movement a struggle. She was trapped in a prison of her own making. I walked to the window and looked down. She saw me, and even through the foam and the glare, our eyes met. "I hate you," she screamed. "You ruined my life. You're a monster." "I didn't ruin your life, Tiffany," I said calmly through the speaker. "You ruined it the day you decided people were just objects to be used. You poured the gasoline, I just put out the fire." 2 minutes later, sirens wailed as patrol cars arrived. They didn't have to search for the suspect. They didn't have to search for the suspect. She was the only person on the block, glowing white under the floodlights, stuck to my porch, like a fly on flypaper. 2 officers approached cautiously with weapons drawn, smelling the gasoline immediately and seeing the red can lying in the foam. No investigation was needed. The crime scene was indisputable. They dragged her out of the foam as she slipped and fought against them, kicking, screaming, and spitting curses. They cuffed her hands behind her back, looking ridiculous and pathetic as foam dripped from her nose and chin, her expensive hoodie ruined and her dignity completely gone. I walked down the stairs and opened the front door, standing on the threshold while taking care not to step into the chemical slush. The officers looked from me to the foam, then back at me, thoroughly impressed. "That's quite a system you have here, Mr. Moore," one officer noted. "I like to be prepared," I replied. Tiffany looked up at me, her face smeared with tears and chemical residue. "Why don't you just die?" she sobbed. "Why couldn't you just die like a normal old man?" "Because I still have work to do," I said, "and because I refuse to let a gold digger with a lighter write the end of my story." They loaded her into the back of the patrol car as she continued to scream, and I watched the taillights fade into the night. Looking at the porch covered in white foam and gasoline, I knew it would take a professional crew to clean it up. Costing money, I was glad to spend for my safety. I was safe. My legacy was secure, and those who tried to destroy me were locked in cages of their own design. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and returned to my office to turn off the floodlights. The dark returned, but it was no longer threatening. It was the quiet darkness of a peaceful night. I sat in my chair, closed my eyes, and took a breath. The toxicity was gone, the threat was eliminated, and, for the first time in a long while, the future looked bright. Judgment Day arrived with a heavy gray sense of reckoning, filling the courtroom to capacity. Local media hovered like vultures, eager to feed on the carcass of a family drama that had played out on live feeds and police blotters. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, my back straight and my hands resting on my knees, wearing the navy wool suit I had bought for Betty's funeral. Beside me, Reggie sat like a stone lion, his briefcase packed with documents that would decide the fate of my son and his wife. Darnell and Tiffany were led into the courtroom in chains, seated apart after Tiffany had tried to attack Darnell during their arraignment. Darnell looked like a hollow shell, his orange jumpsuit hanging loosely on his frame, his hair dull and matted without the expensive styling products he used to use. He scanned the crowd frantically until his eyes landed on me, showing no anger, but an entreating look, as if hoping I would stand up and tell the judge it was all a big misunderstanding. Tiffany, on the other hand, looked furious, her gray jumpsuit stained as she glared at me with an intense, sharp hatred. The public defender, looking like he hadn't slept in a week, stood up to make his opening statement. He attempted to paint me as a tyrant, describing Darnell as a desperate son, driven to the edge by a father who hoarded resources and set impossible standards. He called me a miser and a master manipulator, arguing that Darnell's actions, while unlawful, were the result of extreme financial pressure caused by my cruelty, trying to earn sympathy for a young couple struggling to survive while the patriarch sat on a pile of gold he refused to share. It was a compelling story, and the very narrative Darnell had told himself for years. Then it was my turn to take the stand. I walked up the steps to the witness box, swore to tell the truth, and looked at the jury. 12 strangers who held the power to decide the end of this tragedy. Reggie stood up, keeping his composure, and asked a single, simple question. Mr. Moore, the defense claims your son was destitute and that you refused to provide support. Would you please state your occupation and your estimated net worth for the court? I leaned into the microphone, looking straight at Darnell so he would hear every word and understand the sheer scale of the wealth he had thrown away. I am a retired infrastructure engineer, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. I am also the founder, chairman, and sole owner of TNB Holding. Darnell frowned, recognizing the name from the lease on his house and the registration on his cars, though he had always assumed it was a faceless corporate entity. He had never connected the T for Thaddeus, the N for and the B for Betty. TNB Holding, I continued, owns 12 commercial shopping plazas across the tri-state area, the industrial park on the west side, and holds municipal contracts for water filtration systems in this city and 3 others. It also owns a portfolio of residential apartment complexes, including the one I live in. The courtroom fell silent, the faint clicking of the court reporter's machine the only sound in the room. And your net worth? Reggie prompted. I paused, having never spoken the number out loud before, keeping it hidden even from myself as just a score in the game against blast poverty. Based on the audit completed last week, my personal assets and corporate holdings are valued at approximately $62 million. The reaction was immediate. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, and the jurors' eyes widened. But the most dramatic reaction came from the defense table. Darnell's head snapped back as if he had been struck hard. 60 million, he mouthed silently, over and over again. He had sold a piece of land for $50,000 in fake bills, stolen 50,000s over 5 years, and tried to destroy me for an insurance policy he thought was worth a fraction of that. He had sat at the table, starving for crumbs, never realizing he was sitting inside the bakery all along. Tiffany let out a low groan, slumping in her chair and staring at me with a mix of terror and greed. She had called me a pauper and mocked my truck, only to realize I could have bought her entire family tree for firewood without making a dent in my bank account. "You lied," Darnell shouted, leaping from his seat with his chains rattling loudly. "You lied to me. You played poor. You drove that truck. You set me up." "Order." The judge slammed her gavel down. "Sit down, defendant." "I didn't lie, Darnell," I said into the microphone. "I just didn't boast. I lived below my means so I could build something that lasted. I was going to give it all to you, everything. All held in the trust you tried to break, the trust you destroyed." Darnell was hyperventilating, doing the math in his head, calculating the yachts, cars, and houses he could have had if he had simply been patient and kind. If he had opened the door on Christmas Day, instead of slamming it shut. Reggie waited for the room to quiet down, then walked over to the evidence table and picked up a paper stamped with a bank seal. "Mr. Moore," Reggie said, "the defense argues that your son was your sole heir and that his actions were born out of anxiety for his future inheritance. Could you please explain the current status of your estate?" I looked at Darnell for the final blow. The end of mercy. "Last week, I realized something. Money is poison," I said. "It was the disease infecting my family. It made my son lazy. It gave him an inflated sense of entitlement, and it turned him into a criminal. As long as that fortune existed, he would never learn. He'd just spend his life waiting for me to pass away, making cold calculations." I took a deep breath. "So, I removed the temptation." Darnell froze. "What?" "Yesterday morning," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I authorized a wire transfer. I liquidated 80% of my liquid assets and signed the deeds of my commercial properties over to a charitable trust." "No," Darnell whispered, shaking his head. "No, you didn't. I donated $50 million to the Thaddeus and Betty Moore Scholarship Foundation," I announced. "It will fund full college scholarships for underprivileged youth in this city, the kids who want to work, the kids who want to build something for themselves, the kids who would never close the door in their father's face." The courtroom went completely silent, a vacuum of absolute shock. $50 million. Gone. Wiped clean from Darnell's future. "I kept the house," I added, "and just enough money for my own retirement. But the estate, Darnell, that empire, is gone. I gave it away because I love you enough to let you save yourself. You entered prison with nothing, and when you get out, you'll still have nothing. You're going to have to work. That's the last and only gift I have left to give you." Darnell stood up, swaying on his feet, his face turning a sickly gray as his eyes rolled back. The reality of what he had lost was too heavy for his mind to process. He hadn't just lost a court case. He had lost the winning lottery ticket he had been holding on to his entire life. He collapsed, hitting the floor with a heavy thud, his chains clanking loudly against the wood. "Darnell!" Tiffany screamed. Bailiffs rushed forward as the judge called an immediate recess. I sat in the witness box, watching them tend to my son, feeling a profound sadness, but no regret. I had cauterized the wound and burned away the decay. He was broke, and he was going to prison, but for the first time in his life, he was free. He was free from the burden of my money, free to become a real man, or fail trying. Whether he survived that freedom was entirely up to him. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the chaos behind. I had a meeting with the scholarship board, and I had a future to build. Snow fell softly over Oakview Drive, coating the manicured lawns in a flawless blanket of white. It was Christmas morning, exactly 1 year since my son slammed the heavy oak door in my face and declared I was no longer part of his family. I parked my Ford truck in the exact same spot as before, but this time no one looked at it with disgust. The street was quiet, but the house at number 42 was bursting with life. Its windows glowing with a warmth that had nothing to do with expensive heating systems and everything to do with the people inside. The sign on the front lawn no longer read private property. It was a hand-painted wooden sign that read, "The Betty Moore Community Center." I carried a 20-pound turkey wrapped on foil up the driveway, the rich scent of sage and rosemary rising into the crisp air, just like a year ago. But when I reached the porch this time, before I could even ring the bell, the door swung open. It wasn't a bitter man in a velvet jacket blocking my way. It was a 12-year-old boy named Marcus, wearing an oversized sweater. "Mr. Moore is here," Marcus shouted, his face lighting up with a massive smile. "He brought the turkey." I stepped inside. The marble floor was covered in dusty footprints from 50 kids running around. The crystal chandelier was still there, but now decorated with handmade paper chains. The tomb-like silence Darnell had built was replaced by beautiful, chaotic laughter and music, with Motown classics playing from a speaker in the corner, filling the high ceilings with soul. The house, once a monument to vanity, was now a sanctuary. Immediately after the trial, I donated the property to the trust, turning it into a home for scholarship students who had nowhere else to go for the holidays. Kids from the same working-class background I came from, kids who truly understood the value of a roof over their heads. I walked into the dining room. The long mahogany table, where Tiffany's parents once drank wine, was extended with folding tables to seat 30 people. There were no crystal flutes, only paper cups and mismatched plates. The food wasn't catered lobster or truffle pasta. It was an epic potluck. Macaroni and cheese, collard greens, cornbread, candied yams, and potato salad made by one of the students' grandmothers. It smelled like home, like the kitchen Betty and I shared for 40 years. Reginald Moss sat at the head of the table. The legal shark, the man who had terrified judges and dismantled Darnell's defense, was wearing a goofy red Santa hat with a white pom-pom. A napkin was tucked into his collar, and he held a turkey leg in one hand. When he saw me, he stood up, wiping grease from his mouth. "Thaddeus!" Reggie boomed, his voice carrying its usual courtroom authority, softened by the holiday cheer. "You're late. We were about to start without you." I set the turkey down in the middle of the table and peeled back the foil. Steam rose into the air, drawing a collective gasp of appreciation from the room. "I'm never late, Reggie," I smiled. "I just like making an entrance." Regia clapped me on the back. The students looked up at me, their eyes holding something Darnell had never shown me, respect. Not fear, not greed, just genuine respect. "Have a seat, Mr. Moore," said a young woman named Maya, a brilliant engineering student at the State University, who was the first in her family to attend college. She pulled out a chair for me, the very chair Darnell used to sit in like a king. And I sat down. I looked around the table. By blood, these people were strangers. I didn't know their ancestors, and I hadn't changed their diapers. Yet, as we passed the platters and shared the food, I felt a connection stronger than DNA. We talked about their classes and their dreams, about concrete, steel, and how to build things that last. Reggie recounted stories from our time in Vietnam, exaggerating the details until our stomachs hurt from laughing, telling them how I once fixed a generator with a stick of gum and a prayer. He didn't talk about my money, and he didn't mention $62 million to these kids. I wasn't a bank account to them. I was a mentor, the man who gave them a fighting chance. This house, I said, tapping the table, feels much better now. It used to be so cold. It had too much space and not enough heart. It's a good house, Maya said softly. It's warm. Thank you, Mr. Moore, for everything. I looked at her and saw the future. Darnell had tried to use my legacy to buy status, but these kids were using it to build their freedom. That was the difference. After dinner, while the students cleared the table and argued playfully over who had to wash the dishes, I walked into the living room. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. I walked over to the mantel, where there were no stockings for Darnell and no pictures of Tiffany. The slate had been wiped clean. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a white envelope stamped with the seal of the State Correctional Facility. It had arrived yesterday, and though I had hesitated to open it or bring it here, I knew I needed to close this chapter where it all began. I opened the envelope. The letter was written in pencil on lined yellow paper. Darnell's handwriting small and cramped, so different from the flamboyant signature he used to sign checks. Dad, the letter read, I hope you are doing well. It's cold here. I got a job in the laundry room making 12 cents an hour. It's hard work, and my hands hurt. I think about you a lot. I think about the truck, and I think about the turkey. I'm sorry. I know that word doesn't carry much weight coming from me, but I truly am sorry. I lost everything because I didn't realize what I already had. Merry Christmas. I read it twice, searching for the anger that used to burn inside me, searching for the sense of betrayal, but it was gone, replaced by a quiet, dull ache. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just tired. Darnell was finally learning the value of hard work, learning that 12 cents earned through sweat meant more than $100 handed out by a father. It was a brutal lesson, but the only one that could ever save him. He was sorry, and I believed him. Prison has a way of forcing reality on a person. But a simple apology couldn't fix the broken window, erase the knife he brought into my home, or change the fact that he had discarded me for money. I looked at the fire, the flames licking hungrily at the logs. I love you, son, I whispered to the empty room. I love you, which is why I'm leaving you right where you are. I love you enough to let you become a real man, even if you have to do it from inside a cage. I held the letter over the fire as the paper curled and turned brown from the heat. Then it caught fire, the yellow flames consuming the penciled words, the apology, and the past. I watched it burn until it turned into black ash, drifting up the chimney into the cold winter night. I turned around to see Reggie standing in the doorway, watching me while holding 2 glasses of cognac. He didn't ask about the letter or Darnell. He understood. To family, Reggie said, handing me a glass. I took it and looked back toward the bright dining room, where the laughter of 30 young people filled the air. To family, I repeated. To family, to the ones we build for ourselves, not just the ones we're born into. We clinked our glasses together, the sound echoing like a soft, clear bell in the warm room. I took a sip, the liquid burning down my throat with a pure, comforting heat. I was 71 years old. I had lost a son, but I had gained a future. I walked back into the light of the dining room, ready to serve dessert. The turkey was gone. The past was ashes. And for the first time in a long time, I was truly home.